Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. People will stream in late. We know that security is daunting, but that security is in place to keep all of us safe. I'm Jane Harmon, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and pleased to welcome you in person and virtually. There are people who are tuning in to the streaming version of this, to yet another fabulous, wonderful Brown Capital Management Africa Forum event. Imagine this. This is our 5th annual signature event, our 17th event overall, and I was just sitting in the back watching this movie, and Monday tells me it was from our inaugural event 5 years ago. It's a great movie, and I have to say I looked a lot younger. So our Africa program, led by the one and only amazingly competent and special Mande Myangwa, is you can applaud. Go ahead, you can applaud. Is a first port of call for understanding critical issues in Africa and U.S. Africa relations. But today's event goes even deeper. We're going outside, just imagine this for a moment, the D.C. foreign policy bubble, or to some, the D.C. swamp, to learn how state officials from Virginia, Maryland, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota are engaging with Africa economically. We will also hear from officials at the Commerce Department and World Bank about federal programs that are making state-level cooperation possible. The Trump administration has continued to make progress in economic cooperation with Africa, renewing the America Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, and passing the BUILD Act, which helps U.S. businesses invest in Africa. These are good things. Africa, as many of you know, and I have learned since the very capable Mande taught me, is home to 8 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. And after the African Continental Free Trade Agreement went into force this year, in the world, Africa is also the largest free trade zone in the world. That I didn't know. That means there's plenty of room for U.S. trade and investment to grow. This is the final year, well, for the moment, of our 5-year partnership with Brown Capital Management, and we have a lot to be proud of. In May, Brown Capital and the Africa program had the first ever event outside the U.S. I'm so sad I missed it, visiting Botswana to discuss the role of sovereign wealth funds in Africa's development. The president of Botswana opened the conference, and the vice president and treasurer of the World Bank delivered the keynote to an audience of senior African officials, CEOs, and African sovereign wealth funds, along with regional experts. For making this possible, we are so grateful yet again to Eddie Brown, the founder and CEO of Brown Capital Management. He is a consistent and welcome presence at our Africa program events and a member of our national cabinet, along with his wife, Sylvia. Unfortunately, Sylvia couldn't be here today, but she was here just a few weeks ago for other events, and we really love the Browns. It's also my pleasure to introduce Keith Lee, President and Chief Operating Officer of Brown Capital Management, who will say a few words. Keith, welcome.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harmon. Good afternoon, everyone. As Congresswoman Harmon said, I am Keith Lee, the president of Brown Capital Management. On behalf of Brown Capital Management, I would like to thank you all for joining our discussion this afternoon. I would also like to thank our partner, the Wilson Center Africa Program, for their support in organizing and hosting today's event. As Congresswoman Harmon mentioned, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is a platform of substantive, policy-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and sustainable development issues in Africa. Over the past 5 years, we've had 17 events focusing on some of the most critical economic issues Facing Africa and U.S. Africa Relations. From transforming Africa's education sector, addressing Africa's supply chain challenges, comparing U.S. and Chinese business models, examining ways to maximize women's economic leadership, participation, and impact to the changing global trade architecture. The Africa Forum has continued to bring together the key policymakers, practitioners, business people, and experts to not just discuss the opportunities and challenges facing the continent, but to find actionable solutions to advance sustainable development in Africa and build mutually beneficial trade and investment relations between Africa and the United States. As African economies continue to grow and the continent expands its international engagement, it is more important than ever before that we begin to see Africa for what it really is, and that we continue to have these open and forward-leaning conversations. This afternoon, our two expert panels will assess the nature and scope of the economic relations between U.S. states and African countries, highlight some of the key steps and measures that states are taking to drive economic engagement, and look at how U.S. federal and U.S. state efforts articulate with each other. More importantly, our speakers will offer some concrete recommendations for what U.S. federal and state governments, as well as African governments, can do to expand and deepen U.S. Africa economic relations. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon and for support of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. I will now welcome Dr. Mande Muyangwa, Director of the Wilson Center Africa Program, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harmon and Mr. Lee. As was mentioned, my name is Mande, and I am the Director of the Africa Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I join the two previous speakers in welcoming you to today's signature event. I know that we have a number of people following on webcast and on Twitter, and I welcome you as well. To those joining us on Twitter, you can follow the live tweets of today's event by following the Africa Program's Twitter account @AfricaUpClose, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag @Africa'sTransformation, all one word. We're here to look at U.S. Africa economic engagement writ large, but with a focus on how individual states are engaging with Africa in the economic realm. Why is this important? It's important because Africa matters in its own right, but it's also important because Africa could be a key partner for the United States. The last 30 years, we have seen major swings in Africa-U.S. trade. U.S. trade with Africa grew steadily through the 1990s before increasing dramatically in the mid-2000s, peaking at $141 billion in total trade in 2008. The global economic crisis of 2009 introduced a reduction in trade with Africa, with a brief recovery in 2010 and 2011, followed by another decline in 2016. U.S.-Africa trade has started to grow in 2017, but it has not yet reached the peaks that we saw earlier in earlier decades. So what can we do to build it back up? And how do the states fit into that effort to re-engage and strengthen our economic engagement with Africa? So our event here today will assess the nature and scope of the economic relations between a number of U.S. states and African countries, highlight some of the measures that are being taken at the state level to drive economic engagement with Africa, review how federal level policies and programs are articulating with state efforts to engage with Africa in the economic realm, And because we're always forward-leaning in our discussions here at the Wilson Center, we have asked our speakers also to offer some concrete recommendations on what we can do to strengthen economic engagement with Africa. So we have two panels, as was mentioned earlier on. The first panel consists of two speakers who will focus on the big picture of U.S. Africa economic engagement. Specifically, we'll hear an African perspective via the World Bank on why Africa matters and the current state of U.S. Africa economic relations. We will also hear a federal level government perspectives from the U.S. Department of Commerce, talking about the policies and programs, the current state of play, and the future of U.S. Africa economic engagement. After that, we'll transition to a second panel consisting of representatives from 5 U.S. states, Florida, Maryland, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, who will discuss the various aspects of their individual states' economic engagement with the continent. You, the audience, will have the opportunity to engage with our speakers on each panel after all of them have presented their initial remarks, so that we can really draw on your expertise as well, both in terms of your practical engagement with Africa, your study on these issues that we'll be talking about today, on key measures that we can take to advance this relationship. So it is now my pleasure to introduce the first panel. And our first speaker will be Mr. Abdul Salam Bello, who is an advisor to the Executive Director of the World Bank Group, and he specializes in international relations, African development, and strategy. He has also previously served as a Chief of Staff to the African Union New Partnership for Africa's Development, otherwise known as NEPAD, offices in South Africa. And we've asked him to speak to 4 issues. First, why Africa matters. Second, his assessment on the current state of U.S. Africa economic engagement and how this compares with Africa's economic engagement with other regions. Third, to highlight some of the economic-related challenges that need to be addressed in order for us to foster and make progress in this realm, but also to highlight some of the key positive measures that African countries are taking to create more business and investment-friendly environments. Our next speaker will be Ms. Kessler. Okay, I messed up my pages here. Sorry. Our next speaker will be Ms. Robin Kessler, who is the Executive Director of the Middle East and Africa at the International Trade Administration within the Department of Commerce. We've asked her to speak to the current state of U.S.-Africa trade, offer highlights of the key policies, programs, and mechanisms that the U.S. federal government has in place for supporting economic engagement with Africa. And we've also asked her to speak a little bit of how the federal government sees U.S. states as fitting into the framework that she will outline for us. And we've also asked her to touch on the fact that we have a sizable African diaspora in this country. And so how does the federal government leverage that African diaspora to advance economic engagement with Africa? We've asked all of our speakers today to spend some time talking to us about the concrete measures and steps that we can take in concluding their initial remarks. So we've asked each of our speakers to spend 8 minutes focused on the questions that we raised with them. And then after both have spoken, we'll have the Q&A. With that, Mr. Bello, your 8 minutes start now, sir.
No pressure. Okay, no pressure.
No, none at all.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And want to also appreciate the words from Congresswoman Harman, Keith, you, Monday, Robin, excellencies from various embassies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here to have the opportunity to give some perspective on U.S. and Africa relation. And since I have 8 minutes, I'll try to be very efficient. Why Africa matters? If you look at the last couple of months, you see various engagements between Africa and various countries like India, like Japan with a TICAD, China with a FOCAC, and the last being the summit in Sochi between Russia and Africa. So it means that Africa has a global attention from various actors. And one of the points to be considered is the perspective. I mean, today 60% of the population is younger than 25 years old, which is an immense potential for the workforce. And this also has potential for...
Can I ask you to move the mic closer? Apparently they can't get you clearly.
Oh, sorry. So in addition to that, this population growth also is an opportunity and also a challenge. Opportunity in terms of job creation, in terms of consumption, in terms of economic transformation, but also challenges because if the countries are not able to cater for the basic needs and health, education, in addition to job creation, this will be also a challenge not only for the African countries, but also for the rest of the world. And we started seeing some of those effects in terms of fragility because of the situation you see in the Sahel, in the Great Lake, in the Horn of Africa, that drives not only the security issue, but also migration toward Europe, just to say few. But there are opportunities. You mentioned the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Yes, it is the biggest free trade area after the WTO today. It was launched in July 2019 during the annual African Union Summit, which took place, I'm proud to say that in my country, Niger. It was championed by the President of Niger, President Mamadou Issoufou. And this also is an opportunity to also break silos, break frontiers or borders in terms of access to financing, but also access to business for various parties, hence also the interests of the global partners in Africa. Going forward, assessment on the current state, I would say the United States have been a very good and important partner for Africa, I would say even since the beginning. And we can mention the AGOA, for instance, but also various initiatives such as the Electrify Africa Act, the USAID initiative on the Compact with Africa, the Millennium Challenge. So those are also opportunities that exist. I believe that, but before believing, I will also mention that at the board of the World Bank, we have very good and very strong support for the U.S. executive directors, various executive directors, supporting World Bank Group operations in Africa, in particular in the private sector. And I want also to highlight this dimension. Then, when it compares to other countries, we can mention, of course, there's competition. China, for instance, one of the biggest, if we can say, competitor. But it speaks also on the modus operandi, how China is doing operation or conducting business versus how the United States also are conducting business. I think that I will not say that it is competition. I think it's different ways to do business, knowing that on the U.S. perspective, also you have very strong accountability mechanism, check and balance from the Hill on how also operations are undertaken, I would say, outside the country, not only in Africa. I have 8 minutes, but maybe I can come back with some example to make comparison between China and Africa. Going forward, the African continent and countries are making very good effort in conducting reforms. And you mentioned doing business to 2019, but there is also last month, the World Bank released the 2020 doing business report, where you see country like Togo, which became among the top 10 performer in terms of reforms in across globally, I would say. And if you look at the drivers or the condition of this success, it speaks also to the leadership. I mean, you have strong leadership that is highly committed in conducting the necessary reforms. They put in place various committees and they open also the scope to provide more ICT, internet-based platform for business sector to also be able to open I would say operations or business. And if you make a comparison over the last 10 years, 10 years ago, less than about three countries, actually, in 3 countries, you have less than 20 days to open business. While today, you have 20 6 countries out of 48 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa where you can open business in less than 20 years, in less than 20 days, sorry, not years. Yes, in less than 20 days. So it shows also that there is progress, and countries are taking also the private sector very seriously. And to come back to Togo, if you take the National Development Plan for Togo, I mean, they want to finance 65% of the National Development Plan, which is $7.8 billion, by 65% contribution from the private sector. So you see also the shifts in the way the government are considering private sector. So I will say that there are opportunities for business and for not only American business, but also for global business to invest in those countries. Regarding recommendations, I can mention 2 or 3. I think you already mentioned one dimension is the diaspora. And I think the diaspora has a tremendous role to play in bridging the link between the African countries, continent, and various states. I saw that there is some representative, for instance, from Minnesota. I know that there is an important Somali diaspora based in Minnesota. So just to say that you have opportunities really to have also the know-how of the country's reality on the ground, but also how to link it with the understanding of the comprehension at the state level. So I believe that there are opportunities in that area. The other opportunity, still talking about the diaspora, it is about how to best structure or help the diaspora structure the investment financing to other countries, meaning the remittances. If we take, for instance, the assessment for 2019 regarding the remittances, it's about $40 billion globally for Africa. And if you break it down, I mean, you'll see that for a country like Liberia, the remittances represented in 2016 about 26% of the country's GDP. So there are opportunities to create a business platform or financing mechanism vehicles for investment in those countries. I think this is one area to consider. Second area, I will say how to best or better engage also with Chamber of Commerce, American Chambers of Commerce at the state level or at the federal, but also linking them with the Chamber of Commerce at the country level in Africa to have also a better understanding on how various parties or both parties conduct operation and understand the challenges on the ground. Because at the end of the day, what is important is to have the feet on the ground. And on this area also, I think we may not need also to reinvent the wheel. You have multilateral development banks, can make the case for the World Bank. You have the IFC, which is a private sector body of the World Bank. The IFC is opening thanks to the capital increase of the World Bank, so it's increasing its presence on the continent, opening offices. So I believe that this is also an area to consider. But in addition to that, IFC is also doing what we call country private sector diagnostic to understand the challenges at country level, but also to identify what are the opportunities to consider. So therefore, there is no need to reinvent other wheels. So this is to understand the country context, identify opportunities, but also you have the MIGA, which is the other part of the private sector. 1 minute. I will be done in 1 minute. Is to bring also how to cover investments against, let's say, political risk or various kind of risk, where also the American private sector can approach this MIGA also to help them go in the countries and to cover their risk in the field. So I believe that we may need to see more engagement on that. From my perspective, I have to say I didn't see that enough yet from American private sector engaging with, but maybe it is the case. But I think there's opportunity to scale this up or to be bolder in that area. The last point I will say is why don't we consider various platforms to enhance the feet on the ground? For instance, the U.S. used to have the Peace Corps, where you send people on the ground also to have a better understanding of the country and do cooperation. But why don't we consider some kind of business corps that also can be deployed in the countries? And there is this is on one way. The other way, we have the Mandela Fellowship Program, for instance. How can we make a better use of those young Africans who are coming, having a better understanding also on the U.S. system, and how can they also be more engaged in also bridging the gap between Africa and the U.S. I hope that I've been able to cover the 8 minutes. Thank you.
You sure did. All right. So thank you very much. I think you raised a number of really, really important issues. And I know you work for an international financial institution, so I'm going to reframe one thing that you said slightly differently that I hope we'll talk about when we get to the Q&A. You talked about the good relationship that Africa has with the United States and other regions, but you also talked about the fact that Africa has had summits with India, China, and Russia. The U.S. has not had one since 2014. And so I think a key question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what is the opportunity cost of that? I know there is some real work being done in the Department of Commerce, USAID, and other places, but the visibility, that visible perspective, there's an opportunity cost to that. And so what is the opportunity cost, I think, is one question that we would look at. My other The diaspora as a bridge is definitely a good concept that I'm hoping we can dig into a little bit later, because that is also very, very, very important. And there's some who would argue, you talked about the WTO and Continental Free Trade Area. There's some who would argue that the United States is becoming a little bit more insular on the economic front as we withdraw from different economic groupings. And so that's also something that we need to look at in terms of how that impacts Africa and how Africa comes into it. So thank you for raising some really, really important issues. But I did want to put a different spin on some of the issues, I think, just to help us unpack and delve a little bit more deeply into the issues that you raise. Ms. Kessler, let me turn to you for your remarks on federal level efforts.
Great. Tell me if you can hear me okay. So thank you very much, Monday, and you've raised some really interesting points that if I don't cover them appropriately in my 8 minutes, we can certainly revisit during the Q&A. Just a good afternoon to all of you, excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It really is an honor to be here and participate in this panel to discuss the exciting ways that we are engaging with Africa now and the kinds of plans that we have and the activities that are focused on how we leverage that even further in the future in terms of collaborative engagement. It's really great to be here with colleagues from the state level who work on international trade and investment. My department, the Department of Commerce, we have colleagues across the country in more than 100 offices across the U.S. that are known as U.S. Export Assistance Centers, or in our term, because we love our acronyms, USEACs. In these USEACs, they are the first points of contact for companies that are looking to do business internationally. I know that my colleagues here from the States work very closely with our USEACs in their respective states, and they are really a critical component of the work that we do from the federal level. As I said, those are often the first stop for companies as they're interested in international opportunities. We also have, through the Department of Commerce, our core of foreign commercial service officers and locally engaged staff in embassies and consulates around the world. And in Africa, we have foreign commercial service offices in 11 countries where we are working directly with our colleagues here in the U.S. and directly with those companies to help facilitate those companies' abilities to enter these markets and thrive. I think, we absolutely know that Africa is in the throes of an absolutely spectacular rise, right? There's explosive economic growth, there's rapid urbanization, and a massive explosion in the consumer class, right? 60%. It's nice to hear when statistics are used that they're actually very much in sync with each other. 60% of Africans are under the age of 25. In the next decade, there'll be about 320 million Africans between the ages of 15 and 24. The GDP growth forecast for this year is projected at 4%, up from 3.5% in 2018, making Africa the fastest growing region in the world behind Asia, according to the African Development Bank. And I think many of us have heard the statistic from the IMF that forecasts that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world this year will be in Africa. So while I think it's clear that there are tremendous opportunities, we absolutely recognize that there are significant challenges as well. And to address those challenges, this administration has launched a series of important trade and investment initiatives and activities between the United States and Africa, which I'm going to highlight briefly. So first, we'll talk about the BUILD Act. In October of 2018, the President signed the Better Utilization of Investments Leading to Development, or BUILD, Act into law. And under this act was established the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, which doubled the cap on the financing opportunities and also strengthened the focus on new frontier markets in which this agency should be investing, including those in Africa. Another really important step on the financing side was Congress reinstating the U.S. Export and Import Bank, or Exim Bank, the quorum of that bank, in May of 2019. And in late September, this is really groundbreaking, the board voted unanimously to authorize a direct loan of up to $5 billion to support the export of U.S. goods and services from a number of states, including Pennsylvania, Florida, and Georgia, that we have represented here in our audience and as other speakers here today, for an integrated liquefied natural gas project, or LNG project, in Mozambique. It was the largest single authorization that Exim has had in its history. And this administration is also expanding efforts in Africa to promote procurement practices that focus on best value and not just lowest cost. We've heard mention of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Also in April of 2018, the President signed legislation that supports efforts to maximize the utilization of preferences under the AGOA Act, increasing the number of countries that have eligibility utilizing AGOA, and also providing for the U.S. government's Millennium Challenge Corporation to have increased flexibility. AGOA provides duty-free and quota-free access to the U.S. market for over 6,000 products from about 40 countries on the continent of Africa. If we look at activities as well that really focus in directly on our engagement with the private sector, it's important to highlight the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. Companies, in engaging with the private sector, which is really a key focus for my agency, U.S. companies that are currently operating on the continent have repeatedly told us that what they need to be doing more in Africa is a more level playing field. And this year, we inaugurated the 3rd cohort of the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, or as we like to call it, the PAC-DBIA. The PAC-DBIA is a group of 26 companies, and they're not all large Fortune 500 companies. I think oftentimes people think, oh, it's all just about the big guys. Mm-hmm. A third of the companies on that advisory council are small and medium-sized companies that provide insights directly from the private sector on ways that we can better support U.S. companies interested in African markets. The PAC-DBIA Council provided a summary report. They actually report into the Secretary of Commerce through their advisory council on a quarterly basis. And that the insights that they have provided identified the main constraints that U.S. companies face in doing business on the continent, including structural issues such as developing infrastructure, actual versus perceived risks, data on how you can actually calculate risk, the plethora of financial issues, including underdeveloped capital markets, currency volatility, lack of access to U.S. dollars, limits on foreign banking, and the high cost of capital. They identified regulatory and rule of law issues, lack of transparency, and of course, from a business person's sort of main perspective, the basic in trade barrier issues. How are we actually moving our goods and getting them where they need to be? Things like delays in customs procedures and certain aspects related to local content requirement. So out of these recommendations and insights from the PAC-DBIA, the Department of Commerce has signed memoranda of understanding with the governments of 5 countries so far on the continent of Africa: Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, and Kenya, to increase bilateral trade and investment. These MOUs collectively identify, working together with our foreign government counterparts in that country, working collectively to identify priority projects, priority sectors that can then be shared with U.S. companies to pursue those identified projects. The MOUs also, very importantly, establish a forum for the governments to identify, address, and resolve business climate issues. So it's not just about the short-term transactions, it's also about the overall, how are we taking measures to help improve the overall investment climate. We know that the U.S. government can and must do more to capitalize on the competitive advantage that U.S. companies have and the entrepreneurial spirit of the African people. And it's really in that context that the Prosper Africa initiative was launched. Many of you may have heard about Prosper Africa. It really is the signature initiative from this administration that focuses on, very, very simply, how can we substantially increase bilateral trade and investment between the United States and Africa? And it really focuses on this through 3 different lines of effort. First and foremost, it's about synchronizing the capabilities and initiatives of U.S. government agencies to ensure that our efforts facilitate company deals and that they're coordinated with the kind of technical assistance, capacity building, and overall, what we like to call commercial diplomacy, addressing the trade policy issues that exist within that market. And this really goes to the point that my colleague Dr. Bello mentioned when he talked about, competing with foreign nations and how we compete with China and other nations. It's really not talking about competition in that sense. It's really about doing things differently. And this Prosper Africa initiative is exactly that. It's not really things that we as the U.S. government haven't done before. It's how are we doing it in a more coordinated and effective way that puts the private sector first in terms of engaging on the continent. So I talked about synchronizing the capabilities of all these different agencies. Second, it is, though, also very much about facilitating transactions, modernizing and coordinating the different resources of the agencies that can support trade and investment, and then making sure that that information is relayed to U.S. companies, leveraging our commercial offices in these 100 offices across the U.S. so that companies can actually take advantage of it. And the way that we do that is collaborating not only with colleagues across the U.S. government here in Washington, but more importantly with our colleagues out in the field. It's at the embassies and consulates overseas, working in these interagency deal teams that can talk about what kind of support from the U.S. government is needed, whether it be feasibility studies, connecting companies to U.S. government financing mechanisms, and where applicable, where we would want to expedite a potential deal through official U.S. government advocacy. And finally, that third line of effort is about building African capacity for the long term, to encourage that private sector involvement, to get more companies to understand that, yes, there's risk, but those risks can be mitigated if they understand the environment that they're going into. And the way that we can help establish stronger business climates going forward for the future is working with our African counterparts to remove trade barriers. That's of interest to both sides. That's absolutely of interest to the foreign nations because they're looking for investment in their country. And it's obviously of benefit to the U.S. because our companies then can expand and thrive internationally. And so we know that that's of benefit both to U.S. companies and as well to African companies that are often themselves stymied by those same sorts of trade barriers. So think of Prosper Africa not as a traditional trade aid program. It's not. It is absolutely a new way of harnessing and focusing U.S. government resources that put the private sector first, focus squarely on expanding trade and investment relationships between the U.S. and Africa. For years, we've heard African leaders talk about and emphasize how much opportunity there is on the continent of Africa, and we absolutely agree. Approaching it with the private sector is really the strategy that we are going forward with. Africa's best future lies in increased free flows of investment and trade, not in development and aid. So simply put, it really is about moving our U.S.-Africa bilateral economic relationship from aid to trade.
No, thank you. You covered a lot of ground there. Just a couple of things that I want to bring together. Your last point about removing trade barriers, I mean, I think that's key. It's something that African countries recognize for a very, very long time. And I should imagine that the coming into force of the Continental Free Trade Area will do exactly that. So hopefully what we're going to see is a different sort of relationship there. And then I was intrigued by your use of bilateral arrangements in terms of the U.S. approach versus what the Africans are going for, which is a multilateral approach. But I know we will get into that in the Q&A. But I thought you laid it out very well. Let me just ask you a quick question, because I know we only have you for a moment here before we turn to the States. You talked about the reports that the PAC-DBA does, the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa. To what extent does that actually unpack and pinpoint specific countries as opposed to collapsing Africa into one? And the reason I say this is because for too long, Africa is a continent that has been defined by the worst behavior of individual countries. So we extrapolate from something bad happening in an African country, and we use that to define an entire continent, which then clouds out these opportunities. So I think it's an important question to ask that even as we report out on what are valid concerns that we are taking the time, I think, to unpack. And the reason I'm asking that question is because he raised a key point. You talked about the Doing Business report that the World Bank puts out. And so I see there that you have 2 African countries in the top 50, Mauritius and Rwanda. Those are 2 countries in the top 50. And then you have an additional 8 countries that are in the top 100, Morocco, Kenya, Tunisia, South Africa, Zambia, Botswana, Togo, and the Seychelles. I think it's important that we reflect and unpack so that we're not collapsing and focusing on the negative. We name and shame, but we should also name and fame. So my question to you is to what extent does the PAC-DBA report actually unpack to that level of analysis?
So thank you, Monday. That's an excellent question. And the answer is it really is very, very specific because remember, the input, the intel in that report is coming directly from the private sector. This isn't the government's perspective on what we think is happening on the ground there. This is the private sector telling us this is where we go, this is what we've seen, this is what we're experiencing. And it was with that council that last summer, the Secretary of Commerce and our Undersecretary of the International Trade Administration led a pretty historic trip to the continent, a 4-country fact-finding trip to go and to actually visit those markets. We not only did this include a delegation of from the Department of Commerce, from almost a dozen other U.S. government agencies that are all a part of supporting this broader engagement to grow our economic and trade relationship, but also members of the private sector. And so again, it was very, very specific in terms of what aspects are faced in different markets, recognizing that we can't lump all of these together, and also then starting to put into play, where does the next trip need to go? What other markets do we need to go and visit to be able to identify and understand what is specifically focused on a particular country, a particular region? To your point about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think that there's no question that's going to be a game changer in that sense, because again, the ability to actually move goods in and around the continent is going to be critical. So I think that's something that we are, and more importantly, U.S. companies are very, very excited about what kind of flexibility that is going to give them for actually doing business on the continent.
Fantastic. Okay. So thank you so much. We have an opportunity now just for some brief questions to our panel. We've done an excellent job in identifying some key issues. So if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, please raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you, and once you do, we'll bring a mic over to you. We have a very short time with our speakers. Please stay focused. 45 seconds to a minute. Identify yourself, your institutional affiliation, and the speaker to whom you're addressing the question. So I'll take the gentleman right there next to you, Hannah.
Hello, my name is Jim Terpstra. I was born in the Belgian Congo in 1957. I also worked on the African Growth and Opportunity Act, but I'm retired from the government now. But here's the basic thing. You're using the word Africa as one thing, but if you look at the North and the South and the East Coast and the West Coast, there's a lot of diversity to the different types of economic activities there. So could you give us a sense of, as you're addressing these various economic, could give us a sense of which parts of the continent are affected by which trade issues more directly? I mean, there's some issues that are more important in North Africa than South Africa and the West. Just give us a sense of how the different parts of the African economy are affected by the trade policy.
All right. So there's a lady right here in the red.
Hi, Pauline Muchina from American Friends Service Committee. Could you please talk about the role of businesses or investors in Africa in peace building? Because most of the places where these businesses are going into, there is conflict or there is some human rights violation. Would like to know what's the role. And you said that, it is put the private sector first. When do we put African first? And I would like to raise that as a concern, because when I hear the current excitement of investment in Africa, I look at it and wonder, how is Africa going to come out of this? Is it going to profit only a few people, or it's going to profit the people of Africa? Thank you.
It's a gentleman right there.
My name is Augustine Achu. I'm a graduate student at American University International Peace and Conflict Resolution. My question is to Ms. Kessler. You talked about doing business in Africa in a way of creating a level playing field for also African investors. So my question is, or my comment is, can you speak more on how African investors benefit from this, both removing the trade barriers and however it's going to encourage African investment here in the U.S. And can you give us some kind of a mental idea of African investment also in the U.S., not just, pushing things also to Africa? Thank you.
All right, so actually my sister there snuck in like 3 questions, but so.
Yeah.
A number of questions, unpacking key trade issues from a regional perspective within Africa, so we can sort of begin to understand the different regional dimensions of this question. The second question on the role of peace building, the role of businesses in peace building, and the question about concern around putting the private sector first, what that actually means and its impact on ordinary Africans. And then how do you create a level playing field, looking at it from this end, not just looking at creating a level playing field in terms of American businesses investing in Africa, but creating a level playing field so Africans can invest in the United States. So with that, my brother, you're in the spotlight.
Okay. I guess I have 8 minutes, right?
No. Not quite. No.
Good try.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think I really like those questions. First, about the various region and the business and trade. Yes, if you take the Northern Africa, the Maghreb region, etc., you will see that it's one of the least, if not the least, integrated in terms of economic trade. I mean, you see that Morocco and Algeria, they used to have those issues on border is closed within what we call that region is called Union of Arab Maghreb. That takes from Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, up to Egypt. So I would say that it is the least integrated, and you have the issue with Libya now. You have security issues with Tunisia. So I would say that those are the issues also in terms of trade among those countries within that region. Then if you take West Africa, well, it's in terms of economic integration, it is the best integrated economy through the ECOWAS. Meanwhile, over the last months, you see that we have some issues with one of the biggest economy, if not the biggest, Nigeria, which closed border with Benin and with Niger due to some rice trade issues. So those are issues also we need to streamline. But meanwhile, across the continent, one of the issues also is what we call non-tariff barriers, where also you have a lot of stops, various kind of control, official or not official, that also has a big challenge for trade within the region, but also within countries. I mean, I met with some member of a chamber of commerce in one of the West African country who told me that from the border of one point to the middle of the country, about 600 kilometers, he used to face, his trucks faces about 15 police control, so which doesn't make sense on a business perspective. Then if you go into Central Africa, I would say that it's also one of where you have the biggest issue in terms of trade, I mean, among Central African countries. I think the level of integration is about 2% or something like this. So there are also issues that need to be fostered, streamlined. Then if you go to the Eastern Africa, you see that more dynamism, especially countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and even linking with Djibouti. You see that even they build a new train between Addis and Djibouti that brings also goods from Djibouti, port of Djibouti to Ethiopia, knowing that Ethiopia is a landlocked country. I mean, and thanks to this railway, actually, Ethiopia or Addis can get its goods from the port of Djibouti in less than 24 hours, while before with the road, it takes 6-7 days. So you see those things are coming. You see also on the energy side, the power pools that those regions are putting in place. Like in West Africa, you have the West Africa power pool. In Eastern Africa, they're also putting in place mechanisms like this. The new leadership in Ethiopia also is bringing more potential for economic integration and regional economic integration in that area. Then you go down on the SADC region. Yes, I think led with the dynamism of South Africa, but also other countries, Botswana on one hand, Namibia, and even Mozambique. You mentioned Mozambique earlier. Mm-hmm. So I would say that you have more integration, knowing that part of the electricity in South Africa is coming from the dam of Kaura Bassa that is based in Mozambique. Mm-hmm. So just to give some perspective on that. Then I really like your question about private sector and peace and human rights, etc. I think it is a very important issue because it depends on how you address, you consider the private sector, and it can be a disruptive in a positive way, and it can be disruptive in a negative way. Mm-hmm. And from our various work at the World Bank and studies, we have various studies on the role of the private sector in what we call conflict fragile states, where actually it shows that the private sector is one of the drivers of bringing back peace and stability in the country, provided that in some regions, in case of conflict, you don't have any more system that exists. So the only system that exists actually is individual or private people who organize themselves to bring business and therefore to give jobs, etc. But we should not be naive. I mean, you have various cases where some conflicts are driven from bad governance within the private sector. And at the bank, at least what we are doing is to make sure that when the bank comes with a private sector in those regions, the purpose is to bring what we call the good private sector. And if you bring the good private sector, actually, those studies show that actually you're bringing back or you're bringing governance, good governance, accountability, transparency, etc. But it has to be a continuum. It has to be sustained and sustainable. And then you will be able to bring back the system, the state capabilities, etc. And I think the last point also is, I agree with you on the inclusion. I mean, economic growth or even businesses, they have also to have what we call trickling down and distribution, positive distribution among the population. I mean, shared prosperity. That's how we call it at the bank, and we're trying to push in that direction. But definitely, it's not an easy task. I mean, it's somehow work in progress. But still, we believe that through the private sector, we'll be able to bring more opportunities. That's why even at the World Bank, we did the capital increase of the IFC for $5.5 billion to make sure that also in the conflict areas, what we call fragile countries, that we will be able to bring the private sector also to reduce also the burden on the state when it comes to investment in infrastructure, etc. And therefore you bring also more space for the state to invest in social sectors, which should be even the traditional role of the state to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, let me thank you very much, Dr. Bello, because you've really hit on some of the key points which are really the emphasis. And when we talk about leveraging the private sector, we're not just talking the U.S. private sector. We're talking about the private sector writ large, globally. And think about the way that U.S. companies do businesses. You talked about the accountability, the transparency. It's those business practices that going out and leading. Think about the way that American companies engage overseas. It's through partnerships. It's through capacity building and knowledge transfer. So when we talk about leveraging the private sector and sort of letting the private sector lead, it's because those are the kinds of activities and practices that are going to grow that capacity within countries. They're going to build up and boost up as well the private sector in Africa through those partnerships and through those engagements, and create that for the long term. So it's not about what are you bringing in on a individual basis, but how are you helping to grow those skills and capabilities for the long term to establish relationships that will be sustainable. And that's really the point of what we're talking about. And I think it fits very nicely. You made the point as well, Dr. Bello, about how African governments are taking the private sector seriously. And this is a recognition that that's where we want to make sure that it's those capabilities that are out there leading the way.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I really hate to bring this to a close, this first panel. But I think our two speakers have done a fantastic job of giving us the backdrop against which we're going to be looking at the state, what's happening at the state level in terms of economic engagement. And so please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for this first session. And I know there will be an opportunity to engage even deeper after the first panel have spoken. And so with that, if you please bear with us, I'm going to ask for a 5-minute break so we can transition the first panel down to the first row and get our next speakers up onto this panel. So 5-minute break. Please feel free to stretch your legs. The bathroom is down this way, and then just get back here by 3:10. Thank you. So we just had heard from two very good speakers on the big picture sort of stuff in terms of some of the transformation that's going on the African continent, some of the challenges that still remain, but also the opportunity to look at what the U.S. federal government is doing in terms of the frameworks that they have in place to facilitate economic engagement with Africa. So let us now turn to our second panel, which will focus specifically at the state level. And we think it's important, as I mentioned earlier on, because we often talk about U.S. Africa trade and economic engagement, but we never take the time to break it down and understand how it is playing out at the state level. So we think having this discussion is really important to assess the policies and frameworks, to compare notes across states, to share knowledge and lessons learned and approaches, and to make those connections around some of the policies and frameworks that different states can take from one another and domesticate to suit their own context. So we have 5 state representatives here, and I know we have a couple more who were unable to join us who are following online. And we're really, really pleased to have these 5 state representatives here with us because their states all show different ways of engaging with. There's some commonality in terms of how they engage with Africa, but also there's some different things that they're doing at the state level to engage with the continent. And I thank all the 5 speakers who responded so positively and quickly to our invitation. We also have a representative from Georgia, Ms. Turana, who's not a speaker, but she came all the way from Georgia to join us because she really wanted to engage with our counterparts to be a part of this discussion. So we thank you. And before the DC people jump all over me, I know DC is not a state, but we are in DC. But we did invite the District of Columbia to participate, but they have such a small office. And unfortunately, their key representative is actually leading a mission to the continent, and he was unable to join us. But there is somebody who is following the discussion online. I also want to give a shout out to a number of the county representatives who are here, including my own county of Prince George's County. It's really important that we take this from the federal to the state and down to the county level. And so I thank the different counties that are represented in this discussion. We hope to hear from you. With that, let me now introduce our 5 speakers. But before I do that, we've asked them to address 5 key issues. Talk a little bit about the profile, the scope of their engagement, their state's economic engagement with Africa. Talk to us a little bit about their key policies and programs and infrastructures that underpin their engagement with Africa. Talk to us a little bit about how they have leveraged the African diaspora to facilitate this economic engagement. And from their perspective, address some of the challenges that they have faced in terms of trying to increase and deepen economic engagement with Africa, and then conclude with some recommendations on how African governments, the U.S. federal government and U.S. states can work together to make even more progress than where we are in terms of U.S. Africa engagement. So you have their bios in the program that we have shared with you. And so I'll just introduce them by name and by state, and then get to it. And I'll do so, I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So our first speaker is Mr. John Elling-Sherman, who is the manager of Virginia's Leaders in Export Trade program within the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Sorry, let me take that back. Our first speaker is Mr. John Elling-Sherman, who is the manager of the Virginia Leaders in Export Trade, the Valet Program in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Abdiwad Mohammed, who is a regional trade manager for Africa, the Middle East, and India in Minnesota's Trade Office within Minnesota's Department of Employment and Economic Development. Our third speaker will be Ms. Ms. Jessica Reynolds, who's the Senior Director, Division of International Investment and Trade of the Maryland Department of Commerce. Then our fourth speaker will be Mr. Joseph Bell, who's the Director of Africa Trade Development and Enterprise Florida, within the state of Florida, obviously. And then our last, but certainly not the least of our speakers today, is Dr. Alain Mota, who's the Manager, Business Attraction and Retention, Office of International Business Development with the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development. And so with that, let me turn it over to you, John, to kick things off for us.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Monday. Thank you to Congresswoman Harmon, the Wilson Center, Brown Capital Management, Mr. Lee, and Mr. Brown, thank you very much for your invitation to participate, and thank you, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. So my name is John Ealing Sherman. I work for the VEDP, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership. It is the state's economic development agency, headquartered in Richmond, and we have 5-6 field offices around the Commonwealth. And I staff the Northern Virginia Tyson's Corner office. So my remarks today will be, how we're organized, how we help Virginia exporters, and specifically how we look at the opportunities and complexities that Africa offers. And then I'll give you some examples of how we've helped specific companies and some recommendations on how we can better improve all of this. So in fiscal year 2018, our team, it's about 20 people, international trade team, we have helped about 330 Virginia exporters, and they've generated about $794 million in export sales fiscal year 18, which resulted in about 7,200 trade-supported jobs. This sort of sets the stage, the context of how we help Virginia companies. Our sort of annual budget is about $6 million that is deployed exclusively to help Virginia companies export. So it's a pretty robust program. All states do it differently. We recognize that, and a lot of what we will talk about sometimes is a factor of resources. And I just wanted to sort of lay that out in some kind of a context. But when it comes to Africa, the top 3 markets that perpetually come up for us, and it's a large continent, we understand that. But the markets, we've done the analysis, and South Africa is number 1. South Africa has emerged, and I don't think it's a surprise, as a leading country for Virginia exporters, followed by Morocco, and then number 3 is Nigeria. We have helped about 74 companies travel to market, and I'll explain why that's important later. 73 companies travel to market either on a group delegation trade mission, an independent market visit, or participate in some kind of a trade show. And but travel to market doesn't happen without some element of market intelligence, some research at the front end, and that is really important. I don't care where you're exporting to, and this is really critical to help companies at a granular level understand the opportunities and sometimes the barriers they have to overcome in order to decide whether to pursue that market. So in the last 10 years, we've initiated 145 research projects, and we are I think in the last 5 years, that trend has ticked upwards by 37%. Okay, so of the 143 research projects, there's been a sort of a hockey stick curve the last 5 years. In terms of sector focus, and in no particular order, but it is true that mining services in Southern Africa are a popular sector for us. Food. Our agricultural exports are organized separately by our Virginia Department of Agriculture. IT, including health IT, infrastructure, aerospace, defense, and security. Those sectors typically emerge as the leading sectors recently that Virginia exporters are looking to target. So how do we do this? Well, we start with what is called our global network. Our global network are a group of consultants, private sector contractors that cover 60 countries around the world. So Virginia has people on the ground, boots on the ground in about 60 countries. In Africa, we have a consultant based in South Africa that covers 16 countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, and he's been with us for about a dozen years, Richard Zerba. And in North Africa, we have a new representative who's based in Morocco, who covers the Maghreb. So how do we work? So the 5 field offices around the state go out and they meet with Virginia exporters and begin the process of helping them understand where to export. And they initiate research either internally by some of our colleagues in Richmond or via the global network, in this case in Southern Africa or Northern Africa. But we have a number of standalone programs that are provide additional resources to you. If you're Miss ABC exporter in Virginia, you could apply for something called the Valet Program, which is where I'm involved. And that is a 2-year export acceleration program that is market specific. And it's kind of like an MBA program where we help you write an export strategy plan. And very often, there's 50 companies in the Valet Program at any one time. An African market will emerge as a possibility for them. How do we know? Because let's say you're exporting widgets. We can do an analysis to figure out where the top markets are that are importing widgets. So, okay, if Botswana, for example, emerges as a leading market for widgets, well, then it becomes a question of, okay, Botswana has been identified as a priority market. How do you enter that market? What is the channel strategy? Should you identify a distributor? If so, what do they look like? What are the characteristics? What kind of due diligence do you have to do on that potential distributor, right? So you're basically developing the business case, and the Valet Program gets into a lot of that. We also have something called the Global Defense Program. So a number of years ago, post-sequestration, the DoD's Office of Economic Adjustment granted Virginia some funds to help defense and security companies pivot to the international marketplace to do two things. One is to diversify their products and services into the commercial sector, but also to assist with capacity building by certain host nations, and the AFRICOM, U.S. Combatant Command, AFRICOM, annually puts on something called the African Endeavor visit. African Endeavor, we have participated in. It's like a traveling roadshow of U.S. companies, not restricted only to Virginia, but we have visited Malawi, Madagascar, and Cape Verde in the last 3 years. And it's an opportunity for Virginia defense and security companies to showcase their wares, their products and services to host nation African defense and security officials. All of this is about developing a relationship. And I always tell companies who travel with us, you could have a terrific trade mission, a terrific market visit, but you should probably budget for a second one and a third one, because you got to build a relationship, drink a lot of tea or beer, and return. And it takes that sort of level setting of expectations that the sales cycle and exporting is longer. It's going to be more complicated, and that's no different in Africa. So that's a defense program. A number of years ago, when the mining sector in Southwest Virginia was suffering, state funds were devoted to standing up what is called the Go Global Coal Energy Program. So we had mining companies who were, the coal market in the U.S. was staggering. They looked at the mining market in Africa, particularly Southern Africa, in order to market their goods and services. When I traveled to South Africa last year, there's a company in Roanoke who provides subsurface communication technology, and they were successful, I think, in a contract with 2 mines in South Africa. And finally, another asset, another resource, which I think is important, and these are what we call our trade partners. So, I can shape an export strategy, I can tell them where to go, but sometimes they need banking assistance, legal assistance, accounting assistance, freight forwarding help. So we have under contract about 24 private sector companies who provide, under contract with us, to provide their expertise in helping fill the gap at a very granular level to our Virginia exporters. So if a company needs a letter of credit from a customer in Niger or Gabon, and their regional bank in Southwest Virginia has no idea how to handle that, well, we can bring one of our banking trade partners to the table and to help them execute that letter of credit, right? So the practical expertise, I'm not a banker, I'm not a lawyer, but I know who are. I can bring them to the table to help execute this potential export transaction. So that's important. I will say that the one area where we are modest in accomplishment is the diaspora. We have recently participated in a panel discussion with something called the Africa Network Initiative out of Harrisonburg, Virginia. It's a business networking. I think there's an angel investing forum that they organized. It was in Virginia this year. It'll be in Alabama next year. But we've looked at some stats in Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Morocco. There are diaspora communities in Virginia. I think it's an area where we definitely need to improve. So I look forward to learning from my colleagues up here and how we can do that. But when it comes to some of the ways, 2 challenges that companies typically present us with, and then, that we always try to improve upon, is market entry strategy. So what market are you going to select? And exporting is about choices and decisions and allocation of resources. You can't tackle the whole of Africa or Southern Africa. You have to start somewhere with a market. It could be a landing spot for a regional approach, but you have to understand which market and which business model to adopt. Secondly, due diligence. You've decided on the market, the product, where you're going to go. Do you need a partner? And you need to have that partner vetted. If you want to get paid, if you want to ship your goods, you better sure you vet that partner. And the U.S. Commercial Service does an outstanding job, what is called the International Company Profile, where they will go out and book an appointment at the place of business of the potential partner you're looking to export to, build a relationship with. Our in-market reps in those countries also provide due diligence. So due diligence and a market entry strategy are two key elements of any exporter, and what we're looking to accomplish. And finally, some recommendations. So going forward, where could we improve? I would say education, awareness, and market data. If I'm the CEO of an exporter, I need to, and I'm evaluating a market, I need to understand a long-term trend of data that helps me make a dispassionate business decision. And sometimes market data from some African countries, my understanding is, it can be a little thin on data, and that could be improved upon in order to help at least Virginia executives make a more qualified decision on where to go and why. So with that, I think that's 7.5 minutes. Thank you.
Fantastic, John. Thank you so much. Mr. Mohammed, Minnesota, let's go.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Monday. Thank you, the Wilson Center. Thank you, the Brown Capital. Special thanks to our hosts here. Brown Capital has an investment in Minnesota, one of their many investments. So thank you for coming here and to listen to us. My name is Abdul Wahab Mohammed. I go by Abdul, short name for that. And then my role is a regional trade manager for the Minnesota Trade Office. We have 6 regional trade managers. We try to cover the whole world. So I cover Africa, Middle East, just a short part of the world, under 2 billion people. So at the trade office, what we do is we bring the world to Minnesota and Minnesota to the world. That's our job. We're basically the State Department and the Department of Commerce for the state. And we are about 12 people. So we try to do everything together. That shows you what the states are doing, right? So if I go a little bit deeper into that, we have a lot of services that we offer at the Minnesota Trade Office. We give technical assistance to companies. We have a call center or line that they will call, and that will help them anything from how do I find a lead in Africa to my shipment is stuck somewhere, how can I get connected to the U.S. Embassy in that country? So we do a array of that. But we want to talk more about the state's economic relations with Africa and kind of not focus on the services that we do today. And I will focus on, under these 8 minutes, I will focus on the current state relations with, the state's current relations with Africa, and then I will divide that into 4 parts, exports and imports. What is the current economic trajectory there? And then I will also talk about the challenges that we have, and then I'm talking about how we use the diaspora to increase that relations. And then I will also talk a little bit about giving recommendations and after those challenges. And I hope to do so in 8 minutes.
You have 6 now.
I'm saving paper, so I should get a credit for another minute. So Minnesota is a landlocked state in the middle of the U.S. We have 0 direct flights to Africa. We have a huge diaspora community. Probably the only thing that we share we share a lot with Africa, the spirit of innovation. There's a lot of innovations that are happening in Minnesota. The other thing that we do share is maybe the weather. It only goes 50 in Cape Town and it goes -50 in Minnesota. That's close. But talking about our exports, Minnesota has exported about $33 billion worldwide, and about 178 million only went to Africa. That's under 1%. Our top markets were Canada and Mexico. Our top African market was South Africa, Algeria for some reason, because of the healthcare that is big in Minnesota. And then we have Morocco, Nigeria, and Egypt. Those are the top 5 countries. As a state, I'm developing a strategy for Africa engagement, the state's engagement with Africa. And I tend to focus more on, I tend to see it in 2 ways. There's where Minnesota's big companies are going to, 3M, Medtronic, Cargill, the big companies. They have their own international stuff, right? So they're going to South Africa and big economies. We want to help the small and medium companies go to Africa. As we know, 95% of the exporters from the U.S. are small and medium companies. So we want to work with them, develop a strategy that really talks and sees how the diaspora communities in Africa can be of use to that. So with those exports, we tend to increase those exports by a number every year. So last year it increased by 3%. We think that the small and medium companies are contributing to that. As for the imports, we're one of the few states that may have a deficit, import with Africa, and that may be because of the huge diaspora communities. I bring in a stool that I want to sit on from my home country where I was born, and that leads to a lot of imports, and maybe AGOA is also one of the AGOA initiative is also one of the reasons why we have imports, but still that is an area of development as well. I also want to focus on Minnesota companies. Minnesota companies are leading the way into our economic relations with Africa. We have about 70 locations that are Minnesota businesses have about 70 locations in Africa, led by 3M, Cargill, the bigger companies. They tend to strategically align with our top industry sectors. So healthcare is a huge industry in Minnesota. Healthcare technology, medical devices. That is our leading export year in, year out. Agricultural machinery, we're in the Midwest. Agriculture is huge in Minnesota and South Dakota and in that region. There's a lot of agricultural machinery that goes in there, anything from harvesting, seed drying, processing, all that. And that is huge in Africa too. So we see that as an area that we will focus more on. And we have a lot of technology companies that produce these technologies that want to send it to Africa. I also want to focus a little bit on, we have African investments in Minnesota. That's something that is always get looked over. We have SAPI, a company from South Africa that invests in Minnesota. An old paper mill factory that just went out of business came in, revitalized that industry. Now we have them turning wood palm into fiber. And I think they employ about 150 people. That's an African investment in Minnesota. And have not reached the diaspora effect in Minnesota economy yet. So those are companies that are investing in Minnesota. I also want to focus on the personal connections with Africa. When I say personal connections, now I'm coming to the diaspora communities. We have, I think, about, let me get the numbers right, about 185,000 Minnesotans claim related ancestry to Africa, and of those 134,500 Minnesota residents were born in Africa. So that's a huge number. About 40% of those are from Somalia, another percentage, a huge percentage from Ethiopia. Liberians, the largest Liberian community, I think, in the U.S. is in Minnesota. And that translates to what the diaspora communities are doing. They're convincing their governments to set up consulates and honorary consulates in Minnesota. We have now 4. When Dr. Abiy Ahmed was there, in the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia was in Minnesota, he promised to officially launch a consulate general in Minnesota, and we do have one right now. We have another consulate, honorary consulate for Liberia. We have another, I think, an honorary consulate for South Africa in Minnesota. So the community is getting involved in attracting business to Minnesota, and they're also attracting investments from Africa, also Minnesota's investments to Africa. The remittances, I have a personal story. I send money to my mom. She's in Kenya. I'm yet to convince her to come and move to Minnesota. She does not know the weather. But this morning when I was here, she called me and said, I hope at least you're not spending 45 minutes to get to work because it snowed last night. So she was happy. So the money that I sent, I asked them, what do you use for? Basic utilities. There are Minnesota companies that invest in off-grid utilities. We know where the remittances are going. Minnesota companies, fintech companies, are now investing in money transfers from Minnesota to Africa. So there's this huge opportunity that the line is already there. It just needs the people to do the strategic alliances and partner with Africa and the diaspora communities here. There's another company in Minnesota owned by a diaspora, someone who's from Africa now. He's leading a company called Daus. That's basically the Amazon for East Africa. He's developed an e-commerce business. We went to a trade mission to Africa. Part of the companies that came with us were actually a guy named Kahin. He has Afro Deli. That's basically, he wants to make the Chipotle of Africa. So there's this huge diaspora community that is really leading the way. Part of the challenges that we're facing as any other state, there's a familiarity part of it, there's the distance part of it. People are not familiar with how things are done. We tend to not focus more into what are the challenges, but what are the solutions are. So Minnesota is doing a strategic program that we want to focus more on how we can leverage those diaspora communities to cope those challenges. We have Minnesotans that are leading the way to do that strategy. I am the one who's leading the state strategy for Africa, and we will publish that soon. What are the other challenges that we're facing? Issue of trust, and that can be done if you have a huge diaspora communities here. They could be leading the way in establishing that trust, and you could leverage the payment thing and all that stuff. If money is going from here to Africa, it might as well come back here the same route. So you have those companies that are already involved in fintech. If a bigger company does not want to take up that, we have other ways that can be done. I'll just end with the solutions for the suggestions. One of the things that we're looking at is a reverse pitch. We should work with the federal agencies. I know Ms. Keller has mentioned about the trade missions or the MOUs that have in Africa. We also want to focus on the U.S. agencies leading a reverse pitch where African countries or government representatives come here. They know they tell you what the problem is, and then U.S. companies can pitch for that. They already know what they want, and the winning bid can get, let's see, an MCC funding or something like that. That will be a big solution for U.S. companies to be helped. We also want to focus more on financing. The state gives money called STEP, State Trade Investment and Export Promotion. We give money to companies that want to go and just look and see if there's opportunity for them in Africa. So we'll reimburse 50% of your travel costs. The state will reimburse 50% of your travel costs up to $5,000 for you to just go out there and see if there's a business for you. So those are kind of policies that our state is taking. And I think we're only one of the few states that have a state STEP, and then we also take the federal STEP program. So we help companies attend trade missions and trade shows as well. We're going to Africa Health, I think. So those are the kind of bold steps that we take. As we look into increasing the economic partnership with Africa, we should also look at the states, what we call the sustainability, as Ms. Keller mentioned before. Companies go out there, hire people on the ground, help those families, pay their maybe healthcare or housing or education for their kids. That increases the purchasing power. Minnesota businesses, any state business can go and increase their purchasing power. They get more profit. Maybe they will even find innovative ways of doing that. And then after that, the world goes on. After all, we're all human. So not just focus on the profit, but also help the people. And then African countries will also incentivize if you do that. So those are the kind of notes to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's really interesting, and I know some of the ambassadors are here, the African ambassadors. Your idea about the reverse missions and continuing to explore that, I think, would be a good connection point for you and the other state representatives with the African ambassadors who are charged, obviously, that's part of their mandate and mission here. All right, let me turn it over to my home state, Maryland. Ms. Reynolds.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and to Brown Capital for the sponsorship. So my name is Jessica Reynolds. I'm the Senior Director for the Office of International Investment and Trade in the Maryland Department of Commerce. Our office is responsible for promoting exports from the state of Maryland, attracting investment to the state of Maryland, and marketing the state internationally. And our office has only 9 people, I guess, with myself. Prior to serving as director of our office, I also served as regional manager for Africa. Actually, I had the same territory, Africa, Middle East, and India for I think 5, maybe 6 years, up until 2016. So I've been with the state for 8 years, and during that time, I've really had the pleasure to see the state renew its focus on Africa. When I first started at Maryland Department of Commerce, then it was called the Maryland Department of Business and Economic Development, there really was no one focused on Africa. I don't think anyone actually had Africa in their title as a regional manager. So it was a great opportunity for us to explore ways that we could identify opportunities for our companies to do business on the continent. Some of the ways we've done this in that time, we opened a foreign office in Africa in 2012, and we have had an office continuously there since that time. Our office is based in Durban, South Africa. I think we may have the same representative as Virginia. We also took our first delegation to a trade show in Africa. That was in South Africa in 2016. And we have been back since then, and we will go again in 2020. I should also note that at the Maryland Department of Commerce, we are a small team, so we certainly did not, accomplish a pivot towards Africa on our own. And I do want to note that several other state agencies have also been involved, including our Secretary of State's office, particularly through the Sister States program. That's one way we've engaged with our diaspora and with the community in general, as well as the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives. Some of our local jurisdictions have also been really active with Africa. Actually, I know we have a representative here from Prince George's County. And part of that is because of the strong connections with the diaspora, concentrations of diaspora. One thing you might not know is Maryland, we're a pretty small state, right? A lot of people don't even know where we are, especially when we're talking internationally. But we are home to the second largest Nigerian diaspora population in the entire United States, second only to Texas. And if you look at that per capita, that becomes a pretty significant number. So, I would actually argue that the diaspora we have in Maryland has really helped drive our strategy because, at least during my time when I was regional manager, many community and business leaders connected with me, urging focus in the region, providing many of the ideas in terms of what trade shows we should attend, how we might engage with embassies, what countries should we focus on. And we have been able to incorporate some of those things into our activities. So it's been really exciting to be a part of the state's work in Africa, and I believe we're thriving largely because of our enthusiastic and active community. Taking a step back, I would like to give you some background on Maryland's engagement with Africa and a little bit about our trade. So Maryland exports about $709 million worth of goods and services to Africa each year. And we import just over $1 billion. So we're importing more than we're exporting. But of course, our trade with Africa, there's 54 countries. That trade is very different for each country. So I want to take a moment to focus on what are our most active trade partners and what are the sectors. So our top 3 partners in terms of Maryland exporting out are Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. Our exports to these markets are focused primarily on transportation equipment and machinery, as well as computer and electronic products. This isn't too surprising because in terms of the transportation equipment and machinery, the Port of Baltimore is well known, particularly for its roll-on, what they call roll-on, roll-off cargo, which is that type of export. And I know Egypt is part of the Middle East, North Africa market where Baltimore also has a particular focus. That port sends a lot into that region. And of course, with the electronic computer products, Maryland, IT is also a major industry for us. Nigeria, South Africa, in terms of top markets, are not surprising, as they are the two largest economies in Africa. In terms of the import, our top trade partners are South Africa, Madagascar, and Egypt. Our imports focus primarily, they're mostly primary metal manufacturing and agricultural products. Each country, especially even those top three I mentioned, are quite different. South Africa, it's a lot more on mining and those types of imports, as well as the metals, whereas Madagascar is almost a huge chunk. I think it was like 60 or 70% was agricultural, and Egypt, it's actually quite focused on apparel, printing, and textiles, which, if you know a little bit about those economies, not terribly surprising. Promoting trade opportunities in Africa can certainly be challenging. I echo my colleagues who have been up here speaking that a lot of it has to do with just a lack of familiarity, not having the knowledge about the markets. And so our office, what we try to do is to make sure we have a number of programs to help companies explore those markets, to help get over the hump of maybe being nervous about exploring new markets, whether that's in Africa or elsewhere. So we do have a program similar to Minnesota's. We call it the Export MD Grant Program. Eligible companies can take advantage of up to $5,000 in funding towards export marketing activities that often does involve perhaps traveling to explore a new market. It also includes our foreign office assistance. I mentioned the office in Durban. And we offer up to 20 hours of free consulting assistance to Maryland companies trying to enter new markets. That can be identifying partners, distributors, market research, helping set appointments, whatever the case may be. It's quite flexible. The office in South Africa also serves, not just South Africa, but Sub-Saharan Africa, a number of markets through that representation. I want to note also, since I did mention sort of our diaspora and also our local jurisdictions, that that is one program through our foreign office assistance. We don't limit it only to companies, because we do see that there's ways that service can assist others as well. So, for example, our local jurisdictions can also take advantage of that service, because so many local jurisdictions simply don't have someone that can be dedicated to international. I mean, look at the state levels. We have only maybe a handful, still relatively small offices. So at the local level, that's something that we can offer to try to help more of our local jurisdictions get into new markets as well, and help develop their own strategies. For those companies that might be seeking a little more in-depth analysis, we've partnered with the University of Maryland Smith School of Business's Center for Global Business. And what that program does is they match student teams with our Maryland companies. That program helps companies to explore beyond what maybe our limited 20 hours can provide, helps companies to look more in depth. And we have had a number of companies participating in that program look at Africa as a potential market. Quite often they're looking at trying to compare markets and see where they should go. And then, of course, we have the trade show that we have been doing regularly now. It's every 2 years. It's the Africa Aerospace Defense Show, and that is in South Africa in September. And we will be taking 6 companies with us. If anyone here is a aerospace and defense company in Maryland and you're interested, let me know. This will be the 3rd time we've attended the show, and it's proved to be a really good opportunity for our companies. And one other thing I wanted to note was that we also reimburse U.S. Export Assistance Center services, such as vetting your partners or any of the services that they offer. We also, we do work with partners to try to do other things to get the word out. So we have programs, sort of the established programs to try and get the word out. But, anything else we can do, we're happy to do, as long as we have someone to staff it. And that might include information on opportunities in African markets. I know we've done something with the South African Embassy in the past. We've also done informational sessions, and again, this is sort of demand from the community, such as how to bid for international development contracts. Oh, I was faster when I was practicing.
I didn't mean to throw you off the slide, but
sorry. As well as hosting delegations from African nations. I'd be remiss not to mention our Sister States program that Maryland has, because we actually have 5 sister state programs in Africa. These are with Maryland and Bong counties in Liberia, Cross River and Ondo states in Nigeria, and KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. 3 of those sister state relationships have been signed or put into place in the past 8 years that I've been there. Nothing that I did, but just it was a great to see that happen. And those were actually the Nigeria and South Africa ones. So I think with those being such important economies in Africa and looking at our diaspora, that's part of how that came to be. And those programs really complement our business development activities in our office. So supporting all of these efforts at the state level are a number of federal programs, and in particular, I'd like to note that the SBA has their State Trade Export Promotion Program, which that provides us more flexibility in funding. Before we had that funding, we would not have had the funding to do a show in Africa, for example, this trade show that we've done 3 times now. It just allows us to get into more markets. It allows us to bring more companies with us. It allows us to have a bigger presence. So that really is an important program. The other programs that I know are very important to our companies are those offered through the Export-Import Bank and through OPIC, or the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which will soon be the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation through the BUILD Act that was mentioned earlier. Those are really instrumental tools for a number of our exporters to secure financing and reduce their risk in exporting to Africa. So in terms of recommendations, the first would be for the federal government to please continue and support, which they have been, Export-Import Bank, the STEP program, OPIC, and really, I think the new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation setup will be really positive. In terms of African governments or embassies, I sort of echo the idea of bringing delegations here, bringing companies here, or something that might be more achievable, at least for us, because we're right next to Washington D.C. would even be informational sessions with embassies, about opportunities in a particular country, in a particular sector. I do find that when it's sector specific, it tends to attract more participation. But companies are about those specific opportunities, and if they're able to find out about them without having to leave their home state, it probably will pique the interest, and then maybe they would take advantage of some of these programs we have to get them out exploring. So it's been really a pleasure to work on the Africa programs in the state of Maryland, and I know there's so much more we could do. So I'm really excited about hearing what my colleagues in other states are doing. So with that, I think I've gone over, so I'll go ahead and pass it on.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Let me now turn it over to Mr. Joseph Bell from Florida to share his perspective. All right, Joseph, over to you.
And thank you again, Dr. Mandy, for extending the invitation to us in Florida. Thank you, Brown Capital, for sponsoring this event, and of course, special thank you to the audience here today. Without you, we cannot do this kind of events. I'm not going to tell you much about myself. It's in the book. My biography is in there to save on time more than anything else. But I must say, originally I'm from the Caribbean, small island, St. Lucia. So back there we were a little more relaxed. So if you could allow me to just take my time to speak. But,
good luck.
Yes, absolutely. But we know that for our states to come and discuss our common interests of trade between the U.S. and Africa, it's important to us by expanding on trade between the two continents, we see how countries, small communities, small businesses can develop their communities, their business, and create more economic development in the States. As you're aware, Florida is one of the largest exports state and a major gateway for merchandise trade between North America and South America, as well as other parts of the world, as evidence of the state's long-time position as a global hub. In 2008, Florida accounted for 28% of total U.S. trade with Latin America and the Caribbean, and 25% of total U.S. trade with South America. So it's no reason why we're called the hub of the Americas, and I'll talk a little about that, why that has become a challenge for trading with Africa. Two-way merchandise trade of $153 billion, combined with service exports of $43 billion, and the value of foreign direct investments exceeding $78 billion. International business continue to be one of the state's strongest sectors in 2018, even with the economic challenges that affected Florida commerce or global commerce. Our analysis demonstrates that trade continues to be important, indeed increasingly important for the state of Florida. So as the U.S. economy has become more open and both exports and imports have grown, so to have the number of jobs in Florida connected with international trade. So other than being a peninsula state, we have to trade. We cannot avoid that. International trade, including exports and imports of goods and services, supports 2.4 million jobs in the state of Florida. And more than 1 in 5 Florida jobs are supported by international trade in 2017. And trade-related jobs grew 3 times faster than total employment in the state between 1992 and 2017. So why focus on Africa? Why all of a sudden? We spoke about several of the speakers before, and have spoke about the growing interest, the statistics, the information that shows that Africa will be a great economy in the years to come. So what we saw China as 20, 25 years ago is what Africa is going to become soonest. And it behooves us in the state of Florida to realize that, not more importantly, proximity between Africa and Florida. I will claim closest, although some other states would beg to differ, but we have to take advantage of that in itself. So Florida has been among one of the few long-standing U.S. states with a trade office in South Africa. Maryland and Virginia, we probably shared that same contractor then, but we've been there a little earlier. So since 2002, Enterprise Florida have had an office or representatives in the state of South Africa. And of lately, we've extended that with a trade office in Tanzania and Kenya in itself. The office in South Africa support our Florida companies with market research information, identifying trade shows that Florida companies should attend, with underground industry sector analysis, and developing relationships with the government agencies within South Africa. If it's one of the great things that came out of our involvement in South Africa is understanding the government dynamics in South Africa. And I mean, we have South African government officials that would come to Florida or to the to the U.S. and would make a call to Enterprise Florida. We want to come and visit you. We want to come and understand best practices on what you all are doing in the state. And when we go on trade missions there, it's almost all the government doors are open to us because of that relationship that has been developed in itself. Now, when it comes to our Africa trade program, we focus on bilateral trade. It's one thing for us to see, for the companies, it's the Florida companies, we want to go and sell our products in Africa. We're not against that, to market your products, to diversify it. We're not against that. However, we want to show the African governments, the African communities in those countries when we participate in trade missions, or if they come into Florida to just have a discussions. There are several other events that happens in Florida where government officials would come and we interact with them. But we want to express to them that for us, with our trade program, it's not just focus on Florida companies selling to you, but what can you, Florida, African governments, African businesses, how can you take advantage of Florida's position to move and sell products in the Western Hemisphere? And we'll talk a little about that. I think what we've done with Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean, being a hub, I mean, I look at some statistics and just between Florida and, so an example, Brazil, for example, almost $3.8 billion in trade between Florida and Brazil. When you look at Africa in general, the continent of Africa, less than $1 billion in trade. So the aim, the communication to those companies or to the governments of Africa is, let us help you develop your manufacturing sector. And once you're manufacturing in your country, how about utilizing our infrastructure in Florida to sell your products, not just to North America, but to the other bigger markets that we have trade relations and we sell a lot of products to, or export products to in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will tell you, we have businesses in Argentina and Brazil that will come and talk business in Florida. You would figure out they would just fly to each other's country. Or Colombians and Brazil that are coming to Florida to discuss trade. Because they recognize, well, if I have infrastructure, if I have a business in Florida, it's easy for me to connect to other markets as well. And in addition to come and bring, we have what we call our free trade zones there. You know, the ability to manufacture your products in those countries, or even come and do some small manufacturing in the state of Florida and sell those products to the wider Caribbean and Latin America as well. So many opportunities that we have in Florida to support those companies to develop their export programs as well. One of the things that between Florida and Africa, we now have a direct flight from Morocco to Miami. And we know eventually that would lead to more trade. I was part on that first non-stop flight, and it's surprising to see that flight is filled with passengers on it. And then we now have a direct air cargo link between Ethiopia and Miami in itself. So just as a result of that, we've already seen increasing volume of trade between those two countries. And we hope that some of these things would increase in itself. So, and of course, Port Miami have about, I think, 14 agreements with 14 ports in 8 countries in Africa. So the intent is, let's see how we could bring more traffic into Florida, because what we have noticed that a lot of the traffic goes to, whether it's to the north, and then those goods are shipped down by rail or by truck to Miami. How about coming straight to Florida, and then we're able to ship it out? So what are some of the challenges that we're faced with? I think for us in Florida, the low-hanging fruits. A lot have been done to develop trade relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, proximity as well. And so it's a challenge to recruit companies to now start looking at Africa. But it's good because now they see the statistics, and so there's a greater interest when we're doing trade missions to Africa. As I'm here today, I just got feedback from our colleagues at the U.S. Commercial Service in Ghana that they are prepared to accept 15 Florida companies to be on a a trade mission that I'm conducting in February. But just to, an example, if we're doing something like a trade mission in Latin America or the Caribbean, we're looking at least 30, 45 companies. And that just says the level of interest. But, you know, working with the U.S. Commercial Service, we want to see how those numbers could grow in itself. I think another one I could talk about is the perception side of it. You know, that companies, where are you going to? Oh, we're going to Kenya or Tanzania or Morocco or Ghana or South. Tell me somewhere else. And so educating those companies, educating them about the markets. Now, it's a challenge to recruit them, but some of them, they give in and they would come. All right, I'm going to take a chance with you. When they arrive there now, it's like, why is it that I haven't been there 10 years ago? Because now they realize, well, the difference between the news headlines and the reality on the ground. So anything we could do to enhance that itself. I'm going to go straight into some of the recommendations, and I have some more challenges. But I think, yes.
She's watching.
I'm
Yes,
watching you.
I'm coming.
Okay.
Yes. And I'll end there. 1 minute. Okay. I think I go back to the recommendation side of it is focusing for what we do in Florida. It is let us help you African companies or governments or industries, how you can help diversify your country, your assets and so on. For too long, the commodities are coming out of Africa. How about you now manufacturing those products in your country and you exporting them? And so we have in Florida, we have the equipment, we have the industry experts to support with that, to educate those companies. You know, we have an annual Africando event in Miami that brings a lot of businesses from Africa, and oftentimes I go and speak to them, and the number one concern is, how can you help us sell our products in the U.S.? It's not just manufacturing the product and think it will sell. There's a lot of regulatory issues and channels that you have to address to bring those products in. And so that's where we want to help them on that front. For events like this, more of this should be coming down to the state level, as I think one of my colleagues spoke about it earlier, so that those companies in those states could understand, well, why Africa is important. When we have all those big delegations of government officials, instead of spending all your time in New York during the UN or coming and spend time here in DC and so on, come down to the state level where we could tell you about what we're doing or how we could support your companies. Why we're doing so much with Latin America and the Caribbean? Because those government officials, they come to Florida. They are in the state. They understand what it is to do to help their economy grow as well. So more of those kinds of engagements should be at the state level. And lastly, I would say definitely increase the number of trade officials, commercial officers in Africa. That's important. I go back to trade missions that we go in there. Eventually they say, all right, how many companies can you facilitate the gold key service on it? 10, 15. I've not done any there where they have said they could accommodate 20 companies. And so there's the desire for Florida companies to engage in Africa and to participate, but then you just don't have enough capacity, enough of the boots on the ground in those countries to support the interests of the American and Florida companies. So more support to the U.S. Commercial Service in having more commercial officers in country. And we could talk a little more about the others as well, but thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. I appreciate that. I also did give you your 2 minutes extra for coming from the Caribbean, so don't say I never did anything for you. So I think we're in a good place now. Let me now turn to Dr. Mota to talk to us about Pennsylvania.
Good afternoon. Mr. Lee, Mr. Brown, thank you very much. On behalf of Governor Tom Wolf, I would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about Pennsylvania. Dr. Monde, you are the best. I have attended so many events, but you are one of the best moderators I have ever seen. Okay. And I really like your commitment to time. So that's a good thing.
All right. Now you're on watch, right?
Yeah, before touching on the trade relationship with Africa, I would like to give some key facts about Pennsylvania, because I realize that we have a representative of embassies here, and it's important that they know what Pennsylvania is all about it, because we're talking about trade and investment. So it's good that they know. So Pennsylvania is the 19th largest economy in the world. In terms of GDP, our GDP is $712 billion. So we are in the size of country like Turkey. We are largest than Saudi Arabia and largest than country like Switzerland. As a state, if you consider Pennsylvania. We are also the 6th largest state in the U.S., after, of course, California, Texas, New York, my neighbor here, Illinois, and then Pennsylvania. We also have 6 international airports and 3 ports. It's very important when you do business. Mobility is the key. You want to move in and out fast. So it's very easy to move from one place to another, connect overseas when you locate in Pennsylvania. We have a population of 12.8 million and a workforce of 6.4 million. Very skilled workforce in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is very known for good universities. We have over 250 universities in Pennsylvania. The number 1 business school, which is Wharton, is in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania. Carnegie Mellon University is the number 3 best engineering university in the world. We do have some incentives program for companies that are looking to do business with Pennsylvania. One of the major programs that we have is what we call KOZ, which is a Keystone Opportunity Zones. If the company is located into one of those zones, they get a tax break at the state and local level. They pay 0 tax for 10 years. And that's a very significant incentive for a company to do business there. We also have what we call KIZ, which is a Keystone Innovation Zones. We have 29 of them designed around universities to promote collaboration between company and universities. So if you are located in one of those zones, you can also get a tax credit for up to $100,000 a year to be deducted. We have workforce development, which provide tax credit to company. It's $450 for regular laborers per employee that you want to train. And if it's a more skills job that you want to train, it's $850 that we provide per employee to help you train your employees. We also have what we call Pennsylvania First Program, which provide $1,000 per job created to companies that are located in Pennsylvania. We have Ben Franklin Technology Partners, which is a program that supports early stage high-tech companies that are trying to locate into Pennsylvania. They can provide financial assistance, and joint venture type of things. And also, we have a tax credit. Pennsylvania, R&D tax credit. Pennsylvania is numbers the second largest natural gas producers in the U.S., and we are also the second largest energy producers in the U.S. after Texas. Now I would like to touch on some of the key points as far as the trade relationship with Africa is concerned. The first one, I would like to give you the 5 or 6 main partner that we have in Pennsylvania. I went all the way to 6 so I can include my country of origin, which is Chad. So the first one is Nigeria. We exported 45 millions of commodities to Nigeria. Those commodities are heavy machineries, computer, as my colleague from Maryland said. And we, at the same time, imported 2.2 billions of commodity from Nigeria, mainly oils and other commodities. The second is Algeria, followed by South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, Angola, Chad, and Libya. So overall, Pennsylvania exported 624 millions of goods to Africa and imported from Africa 6.7 billions of commodities. So we import more than we export to Africa. Compared to the U.S. in general, the import of African product into U.S. in general is $35.8 billion, of which 6.7 comes from Pennsylvania. So I would say that we are, if not the largest, one of the largest trade partners with African countries, because we represent at least 19% of the total import of African product into the U.S. In terms of employments, I don't have the figure for the job created by Pennsylvania company in Africa because I don't have the data. But we do have the data from African countries that are located in Pennsylvania. The major job creators is the country Mauritius, actually. I was surprised. I was not expecting that. I thought it would be South Africa, but it's Mauritius. They have 14 companies located in Pennsylvania. 6 of them are manufacturing, and then 8 of them are from the services, and they created 4,100 jobs in Pennsylvania. So overall, we have 4,346 jobs created by African countries located in Pennsylvania, and we have a total of 23 countries, African countries located doing business in Pennsylvania. Already? I just started.
I know, I saw your brother was afraid to give you the piece of paper, but here we go.
That went so quick. Okay, all right. The programs, I'm gonna speak. The program we have the investment office, which is part of my office. We have offices located around the world. They promote Pennsylvania, and if a company wants to come to the U.S., we provide a service to the company. Every service we provide is free of charge. We don't charge the company for anything. We can spend a week with a company and not charging anything, and not even accepting a cup of coffee from the company. We don't do that. It's just a way of staying away from corruption, and if you do that, you will be in big trouble. We also have the trade office. The trade office, they have 15 offices located around the world, and they cover over 51 countries. So they promote Pennsylvania companies to go overseas and expand their export sales portfolio. In terms of engagement with the African diaspora, we work very closely with the the African Caribbean Business Council. In fact, I'm going to speak at their event tomorrow morning, so once I get home, I need to go to bed and then wake up early to go to Philadelphia. We host delegation from Africa time to time. One of them came from Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire. Tomorrow is going to be Cote d'Ivoire again. We also had missions. I had the privilege to lead missions, trade missions to Ghana, Burkina Faso, Gabon, and Cameroon. As a product from Africa, this topic is very personal to me, and I was happy that we had that opportunity to have a trade mission to those countries, but we do have challenges as well. One of the key challenge that I will say is the cultural differences in terms of doing businesses. The expectation of the American countries are quite different than the expectation of African countries when it comes to doing business. When we went on the missions, most of the meeting we had were like business to government officials meetings instead of having B2B meetings. And when we came back, the company were very excited. They started doing some follow-ups and everything, and then it went cold. No response from the other side. And that's one of the disappointments that we noticed. The other thing we noticed is the quality of the companies that came to meet the company that went on the mission with me. Most of them are not really organized. They don't have a solid business plan. They don't have something solid to present. And that's something that the representative of the embassies here need to work on when there is a delegation that is going in their country. They want to make sure that the company that are coming to the meetings are a solid company. Otherwise, it's going to be a disappointment from the U.S. company going overseas. Recommendations, I will say be bold. When I say be bold, I'm talking to the diaspora, the African diaspora here, that you don't need to be a millionaire to export overseas. And I'm also talking to the Africans businesses. You don't need to have millions to come and expand into U.S. Be bold and reach out, and we will provide assistance. In Pennsylvania, we don't have any limit. We can help a company that is just one person at early stage. We understand that, yes, you are small, but you have the potential to grow. And once you grow, you will create jobs. So we support. And last two weeks ago, I had a company from India who came. It's a med tech company. They are at very early stage. And I spent almost a week with the company, taking them from one place to another free of charge, because we understand that they have such a good product. And once they locate here, they will grow. That's how we support. So be bold, reach out to the state, and you will get the support you need. Also, another recommendation will be understand the culture. The Americans business need to learn more about the cultures of the Africans, and the African also need to understand that when they meet the American business, they have to talk business, and stick to the business is very important. That's it.
I love that. Thank you so much. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I think what has been fascinating to me is listening to some of the common and shared points and characteristics. But I think so far Pennsylvania is the only one that says it doesn't have a capacity issue. So that's really interesting as well. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing that. Now we have some time for Q&A, right? Hannah, you're looking at me. Am I off? Okay. So you are here for the first panel, so you know the drill. We want to ask a question, raise your hand. I'll acknowledge you. We'll take 3. You have a minute to ask your question or make your comments. Identify the person to whom you're addressing the question. We'll take 3, and then I'll give the panel the opportunity to respond. So I'll start over here. I see Nee's hand up. I thought I saw another hand back around there. All right, let's start with Nee over here, on the gentleman in the back over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nee Akwete. In terms of affiliation, I am now actually an advisor to Monday. So the panel is forewarned about my question. John, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your last name, so I'll be familiar. I'm a Virginia resident. When you mentioned the consultants that you use, you mentioned the one in North Africa and then the one in Southern Africa. You didn't mention West Africa. And Nigeria is there. And then the first panel mentioned that actually ECOWAS is one of the most integrated economies. So if it's an oversight, can you please talk about it? The second part of my question is actually to everyone on the panel, and this is where my connection with Monday comes in. She mentioned all these hegemons, all these global powers who are wooing Africa and the opportunity cost for the United States. And so I'm looking at it and saying, what you are doing is great, but it could be more if your states talk to each other. We have a National Governance Association. So my question and request is, are you going to push your governors to say to them that when they meet at the National Governance Association, trade with Africa? Yes, the federal government is doing that, but the governors should be pushing for trade with Africa and common approaches, and that will then help you in each of your states. So as a question, are you going to promise that you will talk to your governors? And I will be talking to Monday to follow up and see if you are talking to your governors. Thank you.
All right, then there's a gentleman in the back over there.
Hi, I was just wondering how you all interact with, we're here in Washington, D.C., and they have an interest in international trade as well, and there are a lot of companies here that would be interested in linking up with African opportunities. That's one part of my question. The other part is that you seem to focus on the what I consider the low-hanging fruit, South Africa, the larger economies, South Africa, Nigeria, et cetera. And my interest is actually in the smaller countries that are more impoverished, and I'm also interested in the environmental side of potential business, because the traditional extractive industries business is obvious, but we didn't really hear too much about these other opportunities. I think the gentleman from Pennsylvania and Florida a little bit touched more on that. Thank you.
All right, I think let me give the panelists an opportunity to answer this question, because there were actually more than 4 questions in there. And so what I'm going to ask all of you to do is please try and limit yourself to 1 comment or 1 question, because I do see a number of hands up, and I want to get in as many people as possible. So how do you align your consultancy services with some of the more vibrant and integrated markets on the African continent? What's the true picture there? And then there was a question also about how do you use your national governance infrastructure to elevate Africa as a focus area across, not just within states, but across the work that you do. I think, Nee, that was your question, right? So working together to elevate Africa as a priority. And then interactions with companies located in Washington, D.C., and talking about the environmental impact of some of the work, the environmental issues associated with businesses in Africa. And I'm assuming this has to do with big extractives, or is this beyond? Mainly extractives, okay. So around the extractives, this is a big part of our economic connection with Africa. So how does the environmental issue come into that? And then this was really fascinating, and I'm glad somebody picked up on it. I'm listening to all the countries that you are talking about, and I heard the frequency with which Nigeria came up, the frequency with which South Africa came up across all of your presentations, and then some of the North African countries, the Tunisias, the Moroccos. I think it just serves to reinforce the point that I think we're all familiar with, is that we're missing some really good African gems, countries that are doing really well and that offer wonderful opportunities. What is it going to take for us to get to those countries and bring them into the fold? John, you were first on the spot, so let me start with you.
Sure. So to answer your question, Nigeria, we don't have an in-market representative on the ground. However, when we're in this situation, we turn to our counterparts, the U.S. Commercial Service, right? So my understanding is the U.S. Commercial Service has doubled the number of staff or offices in Africa in the last 5 years. So when I have a company who approaches me, John, I need some help in Nigeria, I say, here's who you call. And the commercial service is organized by sector. So there's a mining expert, there's a healthcare expert, energy and natural resources, and so on. And then they pull in their colleagues from the U.S. Embassy or consulate, in this case, in Nigeria. So that's sort of the short answer, but I do appreciate that Nigeria is a market where we have a gap, and we should probably find somebody on the ground. So, but in terms of, if I could take a stab at some of the sort of African gems as you described, I'll just run through some of the countries that are common contractor does cover. They include Malawi, Mauritius, Seychelles, Swaziland, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, Madagascar, Tanzania. So some of these countries are smaller than the others, and I accept that there's probably opportunities that we may be overlooking. And I think this goes back to my point about education and awareness and better understanding what the data is presenting. And then really when we confer with companies, helping them understand the risk-reward ratio, the trade-offs involved. And you have a map of the world, you have a finite bucket of resources, where are you going to go? And helping sort of confer with them and help them understand the trade-offs.
Sure, thank you. Mohammed?
I'll do the question about the National Governors Association, then I will also do on the environment, and then the
No,
your
do
question. Okay, I'll
So
do
you-
it.
yeah.
Perfect. Mr. Neer, the National Governors Association, I think the last one happened here in DC, and our governor was there, and we do submit weekly updates to the governor's office. And that's how we contribute to keep them up to speed with recommendations on where to end. Minnesota Trade Office is part and parcel of the Department of Economic Development and Employment, but we also have the protocol office for the governor. So we're the only state, I think, that does the protocol and then the business. Why we do that is we are open for business. When an ambassador from anywhere in the world visits Minnesota, the first point of contact is the Minnesota Trade Office. If they're coming from Africa, they'll contact with me to just make sure there's the business component of that meeting with the governor. So any ambassador, any consul general is open to visit Minnesota to discuss business, and I'm the one to contact, and we will do a 30 minutes call with the governor and free to discuss business so that we make sure we work with any country, whether small or big country. So that's how we align our policies, that we use the Minnesota Trade Office as the protocol office to make sure we don't leave any stone tied. The other thing that I wanted to focus on was, as I mentioned before, we focus a lot on helping small and medium companies, and these small and medium companies are going across all Africa. They're not going specifically to South Africa, and the state is doing this to, the reason why we have a strategy that we're developing is that we don't leave any country that there is a potential business. The way we do this is that we have Minnesota's leading companies going to places that they do businesses. We support that, and we also focus a lot of our time and energy in working with Chamber of Commerces that are from all across Africa. So we have Namibia Chamber of Commerce. We hold events with them. We work with them to see what is the niche market in that country. Coming to the economic, the environmental impact, Cargill, 3M, these major companies have programs where they will work with nonprofits to make sure that if there's any environmental challenge or if there's an effect onto their programs, that is actually covered by supporting the local communities, the nonprofits, to make sure that those effects are covered. So that's one thing that we talk to our companies to make sure that that doesn't happen.
All right. Thank you. Jessica?
Sure. Well, I should probably note that our governor is currently the chair of the National Governors Association, so perhaps that one falls on our office. A couple of other ways that the states could maybe talk to each other. One is SIDO, the state International Development Offices. They get together as well. And our office has been very active there as well. And, in terms of also trying to make sure we get the message up to leadership. Like I said, it's not just us at Commerce. We have other offices in the state. We do have a separate Secretary of State's office. We have sister state committees. There's a committee of private citizens who are involved with each of those, and I know that they often raise issues up to the governor's office, as well as the governor's Office of Community Initiatives, which is made up of different populations within the state that have a particular interest. So I know that those are some ways we can get the message out, but point taken. In terms of sort of choosing some of the easier countries, if you will, or the low-hanging fruit. Why do we choose the countries we choose to focus on? It's basically demand from our own business community. Where are they asking us to export? Where do they want us to do a trade show? And what industries are they focusing on? We don't want to dictate this to our business community. So for us, as I mentioned, Nigeria is a significant diaspora, so that is where that's coming from. It's our private citizens who sort of organized together with our Secretary of State's office to put together these sister state communities, 2 of them in Nigeria, 1 in South Africa. So, that's where that interest and drive is coming from.
Thank you. Joseph.
I want to echo what Jessica just mentioned in terms of the private sector companies that's driving the countries that we should take on trade missions. Because at the end of the day, it is their money, it's their own investment into those countries. But notwithstanding, we still have several Florida companies that are selling all over the continent of Africa. I mean, I was looking at an Exim Bank report on the state of Florida, and Ghana comes up number 3 as the number 3 country in terms of ranking as to where Florida companies utilize the Exim Bank resources to sell their products, and I have no doubt that there are other countries in there too as well. On the question of on the governor's side of it, I think this discussion here with the states, we could take it even further and just continue to interact with one another and see, all right, what is it that Maryland is doing that Florida is not doing? What is Virginia is doing that Florida is not doing? And we learn from each other, and then more inclusions from the states would, if you just push it to the governors, I don't think much will happen. But if we start it at this level here, I'm certainly sure that it will move up the chain quicker than the other way around. And last one I would talk about is interaction with the smaller countries. One of the we utilize the U.S. Commercial Service. The state of Florida is the Gold Key program. The state of Florida is the largest user of that program. So it's not necessarily a trade mission that we're doing in Africa, but just the Florida companies on a whole, they want to go there. And so the U.S., they would contact us to receive a grant funding from that. But sometimes the U.S. Commercial Service would reach out and say, there's a Florida company that's interested in selling to Senegal, to Rwanda, to Ethiopia. So we're in all those countries, but again, it goes back to in identifying the key markets that we should focus. It's driven by the private sector.
Thank you. Alain.
All right, so we'll touch on the talking to each other. I think we do talk to each other at a certain level. Yes, we compete. As a state, you cannot believe it, but we compete. That is a casual competition because we compete with Maryland, not Florida, is kind of too far away. We compete with Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, all those states. But at the end of the day, if the company decides to locate somewhere, it's still in the U.S. Yes, we are a state, but we are also a country. So when we want the business, we compete. But once the company makes the decision, it's fine with us. We are always happy that they land somewhere in the U.S., and that's the key. But we do talk to each other, and we compete at a certain level. The other question about what it will take to bring some of the African countries on board, I think that's a business decisions because the companies are the ones who know what is best for them. As a state, we don't make those decisions for the company. So my advice is for the the African embassy represented here to reach out to the respective country, the business community or the Chamber of Commerce in the respective country and say, hey, can you identify a couple companies, that have a solid structure and maybe organize a mission, inbound mission, come here and see what we have as opportunities. And then once they come, we can take them around and provide the opportunity that we have here. But we cannot make those decisions for them. That's up to them to make the decisions. So when we picked location, what country want to go on trade missions, we look at different variables. And one of the key is the political stability of the country and also the security, because we don't want to go to a country when the security issue will be, we don't want to go that. It's difficult. And sometimes when we check at the website of the Department of State, they don't advise to go to certain countries. So that guide also the decision that we make.
I think you're just about to open a can of worms with that comment. And you're really letting us know that you are facilitators. Is what you do, but at the end of the day, it's what the companies themselves decide to do. Yes. So we do understand that. But I also do know that there's been a concern within the African community about how the State Department designates those risk levels and the travel advisories, rather. And so those are all issues that I think factor into the larger discussion. And I know some of these is out of the mandate of what we're discussing here, but it is important to point out, because I have heard from several ambassadors about the impact of those travel advisory for some of their countries and some of the debilitating impact that it can have in terms of how their countries are perceived. So it's important that we raise it, but it's beyond our scope here. So let me do this. We have Ms. Turano here, who traveled all the way from Georgia as a state representative. I wanted to give her an opportunity to share with us. And then I will take 4 quick questions and then give each of our speakers 1 minute to just close us off with whatever last thought you have, whether it's answering a question or something else that you wanted to touch on that you didn't get a chance to share. So, Abby.
Hi, everybody. I'm Abby Turano. I'm with the Department of Economic Development with the state of Georgia. I had a question. Joseph from Florida made me think about something you mentioned with regard to imports, import assistance. So I think all the states have similar experiences. We know that trade is a two-way street, that trade benefits both sides, that it's a beneficial thing for everybody involved. But it's a lot easier to demonstrate direct financial benefit to our states and to go back to our legislators and our state legislators and our governors by pointing to export assistance that grows our coffers, right? So you mentioned that you have some form of import assistance, or you help companies that are interested in entering the Florida market. I wondered if you could expand a little bit on that, and if any of your of the other states represented had any experience in that, or if just like Georgia were export focused. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
A very good question.
Hang on, Joseph. Let me just take 3 more. Sorry. I'll take the gentleman over here. I'll take the gentleman over there. And I thought I saw somebody way in the back that I didn't get to. I'll take the gentleman back there. Please try and keep it very short, just within a minute, so we can bring this to a close within time.
Okay, thank you. Dave Rubinowitz, retired. One of the biggest impediments to development in Africa is corruption. I know there are U.S. federal laws against participating in corruption. Are there any state regulations, or do you give any kind of help to your clients to keep them from promoting corruption in Africa?
All right, the corruption question, the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. I'm Fred Oladende with the Foundation for Democracy in Africa and the AGOA Civil Society Network. One of my questions also is to Joseph Bell and his follow-up to the colleague from Georgia. Given the fact that the state of Florida is the largest distributors of cut flour in the United States, bar none, and given the fact that you have several sister airport agreements, sister seaport agreements, what are the kind of outreach that your state is making, particularly to companies and to export promotion agencies in Africa? I know you have your consultants, and I do also know you work with the Gold Key program, but are you making specific efforts to work with the export promotion agencies on the ground? And are you also reaching out to the investment promotion agencies in the different countries in Africa to be able to optimize the advantages, the strategic advantages that the state of Florida provides to expand trade with the United States? Thank you.
All right, thank you. There was, what was it? The gentleman back there?
Hello, my name is Omo Igehon, and I'm from Portals Global Consulting in McLean, Virginia. I just had a question about engaging the diaspora. Every time in these forums that the diaspora mentioned, there's a quick reference to the remittances going back to Africa. Most times those remittances are going to families. Like he said, Abdul, it's my mom's money. So it's kind of weird to be banking on the diaspora, diverting that money somewhere else. So my question is, are there other creative ways besides going after remittances that we're thinking of meaningfully engaging with the diaspora communities within our states?
All right. So 4 really good comments on the import assistance, the corruption question, export promotion agencies in Africa and how you're working with those, and then getting beyond remittances to find creative ways of engaging on all that the diaspora has to offer. So let me do this. I started this way at the beginning. You have 1 minute each. I'll start with you, Alan, and then bring it in. Either close us off with a thought that you think is really important that we need to go home with, or answer one of the questions that you get. And if your question is not answered, you'll have the opportunity to engage with the participants during the speakers during the reception. So Alan, you 1 minute.
Thank you. I will go with if there is any other meaningful way to engage with the African diaspora. I think there are different ways to engage with them. One of them is for the diaspora to reach out to the department, because there are so many opportunities at the state level that we have no idea they exist. Perhaps at the state in Pennsylvania, we have what we call the minority business loan, which is available for minority business owners. But very few know about it. And sometimes we have people going out to the community, reaching out and say, you can come and apply. You can get the loan to start your business and everything else. But it's very difficult for them to organize themselves and come up with something solid, a solid business plan to show. So we need to do this kind of outreach. Secondly, the diaspora here can also think about what are the opportunities in Africa that we can bring here, since we already live here. It's amazed me as an African to go to a Chinese store to buy African product. And you don't see any African business owners selling those things. There exists, but very rare. Most of the time you have to go to the Chinese grocery to find the African product. And that's something that we can do here. I think information is the key, and we need to focus on that.
All right. Thank you. Joseph?
I'll attempt to address to the 2 questions. One. Okay, export assistance. I could only speak with Fred later. We do not provide financial incentives to the foreign companies for this discussion, Africa, to export products into the U.S. No. What our message to them is that we already recognize the value of trade with Latin America and the Caribbean. The amount of distribution companies in owned by Latin American businesses that are located in Florida. And the aim is either to complete the manufacturing of products in the U.S. because they want to have made in the USA. That means a lot to them. Or utilize the free trade zones where they do not pay any import duties if the products are just coming to be put on a next vessel to move somewhere else. Because sometimes that's the quickest way for the products to between, let's say, Mexico and Panama. It's the quickest way for that product to get to Panama or vice versa. Bring it to Florida and move on to the next market. So what we're saying is that we have the infrastructure in place in Florida. Why don't you utilize it to get to markets that you did not even realize are there? When I talked about the trade numbers in itself, but what's the benefit for Florida in itself? Well, you go down to South Florida, you go to the ports area, the amount of warehouses, that's creating jobs. The amount of the banking industry take advantage of providing loans to those companies. That's business to them in itself. Our trucking company, our logistics companies, I mean, you go there and you would see the solid infrastructure that is being developed because of trade and the amount of jobs. And I talked about the 2.4 million jobs that are associated with those. A lot of this is not necessarily manufacturers in Florida that are manufacturing the product, but because the service providers in itself. So if you look at it from that perspective, it's a strong case to support. Again, no, and I understand you say we're not providing the fund. But more importantly, the companies that we interact with in Africa, they need training. And I wrote down something that one of my colleagues talked about, knowledge transfer. It is the ability, we know how to do it in Florida. Why not share that information with the African companies, with the African government? This is how we do it. We could help you do it. And as I said, selling our equipment to them so that they're now, instead of shipping all your commodities, you're now manufacturing your commodities and selling them to you. I watched, there's a juice manufacturer in South Africa. It's called Ceres. You go to stores in Florida and their products are on the shops in Florida. You wonder, how is that possible? Again, it's all about sharing knowledge so that we're all a connected, a global community. Let's see how we could help one another. And Fred, I will speak to if you...
Jessica, thank you.
You tried. You tried.
I'm going all African mother on you now, right? All right.
With regards to the question on corruption, I'll just touch very quickly. There's federal law on that. So our role at the state level, my guess is this is the same with my colleagues, is to make sure companies are aware of that. But if we were to add anything else, it would, the federal law is the federal law. So that has to be adhered to. With regards to, engaging the diaspora, we actually have not focused that much on remittances per se. For us, I think the key is to listen. We have such an engaged diaspora in Maryland. And, in many cases, these are the business owners who are most willing to explore some of these markets that other business owners may be hesitant about. So, I think listening to them, they understand in many cases these markets. They're more willing to explore those markets. And they then, I think, if we can take on some of their ideas and actually put them into action. We can't always do everything. But if we can take some of those, then, it's really the diaspora that can lead other businesses into some of these markets.
Thank you, Jessica. Mohammed, before you get started, so we like to engage our Twitter people who are following and in the discussion. There's a question here directed to you. So with your permission, I'd ask you to take this one. And you still have a minute, though. So just take this one. The question is, could the representative from Minnesota explain a little bit more about the reverse pitch concept? Would that be a way to get more innovative technologies from smart grid companies to Africa?
Great question.
Yep.
So since I only have a minute to answer two, I'll maybe link them together.
There you go.
With the import. So the reverse pitch idea is that there is opportunities in Africa, and the solutions may be here. The governments in Africa could do the research, know what is the need, and with the help of U.S. commercial services and MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporations, and with Prosper Africa, could hold an event together where they will say, okay, country A, B, and C has off-grid needs or has a solar need or something. And then U.S. companies could pitch on that. When you task a U.S. company to go out there and find opportunities, you're spending resources and time for them to figure out what is there. If you already have governments that are already here saying, we need this, half the job is done. So then companies will pitch for this idea, say that, okay, I have a solution for country A that has this problem. I'll pitch for that idea. Then Millennium Challenge Corporations, the Prosper Africa, Power Africa, all these could give grants to that U.S. company to now give the solution. And even there's going to be a lot of downstream other projects. For example, another company that just does a small part of it could also partner with that bigger company that won that project. this is part of the things that I was talking when I said I was going to develop a strategy for the state in Africa. I'm talking to our Fortune 500 companies to share experiences that they have already in Africa, and then how this idea could be brought into a national level. We already do U.S. Africa business summits. We already do African development business, but those projects are there. The idea is already there. We just needed to develop more. So that's one. As far as the diaspora communities, Mr. Amon, since I mentioned the remittances, that the reason why I did mention that is already that is the existing infrastructure. That's why the Somali embassy did a summit here for the diaspora communities from Somalia to see how that remittances could be structured in a way. There was a $5.4 billion that went to just Somalia for remittances, and that was they partnered with the World Bank to give at least a structure for that. If 5% of that could be going into those families investing, that'll be a huge issue. But engaging the diaspora in different ways, I will say 2 ways. We develop the workforce so that we have better business, trained individuals that could help U.S. companies, find a footprint in Africa. There could be distributors. There could be managers for them. The issue with that is there's a trust issue. There's a lot of diaspora communities. You can go around and talk into Fortune 500 companies to be a distributor, and then there's that trust issue. How can we help that? We have governments setting up consulates, chamber of commerces we're helping to move to Minnesota. Now, what that government will do is they can say, this person is from that community and is working with the consulate. The embassy already knows about this person, and they have this consultancy that you could work with. So those are kind of innovative solutions that we want to do with the diaspora communities. We merge our trade office with our workforce development part of it so that we could have a more trained workforce that could help lead the missions in Africa.
Thank you. John.
Thank you very much. So to touch on the question about FCPA, so yes, we do have our legal trade partners provide or disseminate information on updates to the FCPA program to help Virginia exporters truly understand the consequences and to what the rules are they need to abide by when they participate in a trade mission or travel with us somewhere overseas. And typically that's extended when we arrive in a country. We have the local U.S. Commercial Service rep provided what is called the country briefing, where they talk about that. And so there's plenty of information we provide to our exporters to make sure everybody's fully on board with those regulations. When it comes to imports, that is a topic that we are taking a much closer look at. I think one of the ways to think about imports is, can a manufacturing company source an intermediate input in the final assembly of their finished product? Sure, if it makes them more competitive as a company and makes their piece of machinery more effective, then we will do that. I mean, the Port of Virginia has the deepest channels in the East Coast, maybe with Savannah and Newark and Baltimore. So we are constantly thinking of new ways to drive not just export traffic, but also import traffic through the Port of Virginia. So there's plenty of studies and initiatives underway to formalize an import program, if you will. But I think, one of the takeaways I have from today, there's an article here from McKinsey, November 2018, about Africa's global business revolution. And there's a statement here that says, the instinct of most business people is to underestimate Africa's size and potential as a market, but overestimate the challenges of doing business there. So I think this afternoon we certainly tested that statement. And I know personally that I've learned a lot from counterparts in here and all of you. That the opportunities are clear, but the challenges are no less daunting. But thank you, Dr. Monday.
Thank you. All right, I really hate to bring this session to a close. I think we've had two fantastic panels today, and so I'd ask you to please join me in thanking our speakers on this panel for doing such a great job in helping us to understand what's going on at the state level in terms of the economic engagement in Africa, for very directly speaking to some of the challenges, but also speaking to the opportunities that they see and some of the work that they are going to try to do to deepen and expand those relationships. So please join me in giving them a hand. I would normally be doing a summary of the key points, but I thought both panels did a fantastic job of really speaking very directly and clearly to their issues. And so I will forego that summary session. But now I'd like to invite Mr. Brown to please come and close us off.
Hello, you still awake? Just barely. I won't be too long. Let me thank Dr. Moangwa once again. I've never seen anyone get to key issues so quickly, succinctly as Monday. So thank you very much. You know, my title used to be Chairman, CEO, and founder of Brown Capital Management. But a few years ago, I noticed one of my friends on Wall Street, who was a founder of a firm, his business cards say founder, chairman, and CEO. I mentioned that to some of my colleagues, and 2 weeks later, that's who I am. You know, Monday is just so great at putting together a great program. You guys realize that you are at a signature Brown Capital Wilson Center Forum. There are 3 to 4 a year. One each year is classified as the signature event. Give yourselves a hand for being at the signature event. Okay, so one requirement. How did we choose these states? Of course, you went through a laborious process doing a lot of business on the continent. But I said one additional requirement, Monday, is that Eddie Brown must have some connection to these states. So let me give you the connections. Virginia. My wife was born in King William, Virginia, 26 miles from Richmond. Minnesota, one of our first 4 clients 36 years ago at Brown Capital was from St. Joseph, Minnesota. Maryland, of course, Brown Capital is headquartered in Baltimore. That's an easy one. Florida, I was born in Apopka, Florida.
Come back home.
Stay in Baltimore.
I was just there last week. Apopka. Yes. The Pennsylvania, I moved from Florida, graduated from Allentown High School in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So yes, there's a connection, but they are just great for what they're doing on the continent. You know, I would like to say we greatly appreciate your continued support and interest in the Africa Forum. And we co-host this, of course, with our partners, the Wilson Center. And my wife Sylvia and I, have served for many years, probably too many, on the national cabinet of the center. And in 2014, when President Barack Obama had the Africa Summit at the White House, and I think it was the first time in history that I think it was 25 African leaders were invited, it sparked an idea that the continent had not been raised to such a high level. So that's when we talked with the folks here, one of the top think tanks, not only in the United States, but in the world, to let's partner and create what you see here as the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. So that's how it came about. So today, you've heard about the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, some of what we have accomplished over the last 5 years, and most importantly, you have seen firsthand the types of questions the forum seeks to answer and tackle and provide practical solutions for addressing these questions. What I want to spend a few moments reflecting on now is what all of this means. Why does the forum even matter? What has 5 years of work under the forum told us about U.S. Africa Economic Relations, really? 5 years ago, when Brown Capital Management was discussing this project with our partners here at the Wilson Center, we wanted to develop a first-in-class platform that was filling an important gap in the conversation by looking out over the horizon and exploring underexplored questions for the U.S. The first effort was to hire a first-class director. She's to my left. Let's give Monday a hand. It was important to us at the forum that the forum addressed long-standing questions such as, and someone asked the question, corruption. In fact, there was a forum on that topic. I think it's still up on the web. Or a debate over trade versus aid, while also looking at some of the innovative developments in the economic relationship. Undergirding all of this was our priority to reframe the conversation. Africa is often referred to as a problem. As my colleague Keith Lee aptly stated, and I quote, "The narrative that we hear about Africa is one of poverty, war, and ineffective failed states. This has never been the entire story, and today, more than ever, Africa is undergoing enormous transformations that challenge this narrative," end quote. At Brown Capital, we wanted to be part of challenging this narrative. It was important that our events were never a one-sided conversation, but were informed by African expertise and knowledge. The Brown Capital Africa Forum takes pride in its approach of working with African partners, and we've done this over the years, over the last 5 years. Here are a few things that we have learned through this forum. First, Africa is important. Of course, if you are sitting here, you may take for granted that statement. But as many of you also know, for too long, U.S. Africa relations have been defined by security risks and humanitarian crises. Nevertheless, even a cursory look at the information on Africa's economic growth, which you've heard about today, booming population, and business and regulatory reforms, institutional reforms, and the drive towards more economic integration highlights what many international partners have already internalized, that Africa is a key economic partner for any country's economic policies. Our 2017 event that looked at Africa's expanding economic engagement with trading partners outside of the U.S., China, and the EU drove home this point. Turkey, Japan, Brazil, the Gulf states, among others, are investing in Africa. One of our speakers last year, Dr. Travis Atkins, reinforced this point when he urged that the U.S. should see the continent for its own merits and approach it as a partner, not as some kind of toy that we want after seeing someone else play with it. That was a quote, Dr. Atkins. U.S. trade with Africa has fluctuated widely over the last 30 years. Currently, it has seen growth over the past few years, but it still remains, as Monday said earlier, below its peak. There's clearly more room for strengthening this relationship. Second, you thought I was finished. Africans are driving this agenda. Africa is home to enormous economic dynamism and many opportunities. Some of the key issues which the Africa Forum has engaged with over the past 5 years has been to look at how African citizens and governments are driving forward economic development. The African continent, You did know that it is a continent, not a country. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a hallmark agreement, an example of ways in which Africans are defining the terms by which they want to engage with the rest of the world. Reflecting on our conference in Botswana, we did that, a few people from Brown Capital a few months ago. We joined leaders from across African governments and institutions who are building innovative and sustainable ways to grow their national economies through sovereign wealth funds. And I think we had 11 of the 14 sovereign wealth funds on the continent, 11 to 12 attend that event. And it was outstanding. I think the ambassador from Botswana may be joining us later. He's here?
No, the Deputy Chief of Mission is here.
Oh, okay, from Botswana. Okay, and third, public-private cooperation is essential. The Africa Forum is a public-private partnership. This approach has allowed us to bring together diverse actors from across the public and private realms and expand the bounds of conventional conversations which do not consider both perspectives. There's room for more creative thinking about how the public and private sectors engage in this process. The big questions around trade, investment, development in Africa, and U.S. Africa relations cannot and will not be answered by governments or private business interests alone. They require an open dialogue between the engaged parties to find a shared vision for the way forward. And finally, there's more work to be done. As you can tell from even today's conversation, how much more we could have covered. You still have 1 minute each. There's more work to be done. So I'm proud of what the Africa Forum has accomplished, and we look forward with great anticipation and expectation of future efforts. With that, I thank you all for joining us and also those online that joined us. Okay, Monday.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for those very kind words. And let me just add to your thanks, because this is a very special event for us. It's the 5th anniversary of the Brown Capital and Africa Program partnership. I want to echo your words. I've said this to the Brown Capital leadership team about how much your support and your investment in the work that we do at the Africa Program on U.S. Africa relations, Africa trade, investment, and development means a lot to me. Not just in my professional capacity, but as an African-born person, also in my personal capacity. The support that you have provided over the 5 years, the ability that you have given us to be able to delve deeply and honestly and with integrity into the issues that impact Africa and U.S. Africa relations mean a lot to me. So to Brown Capital Management, thank you, thank you, thank you. I cannot thank you enough for what you've done over the last 5 years. So thank you. Let me also, we had an outstanding turnout of members of the African Diplomatic Corps at this event. Thank you also to all of you for your support. I have seen you not just at this event, but at many other previous events as well. I have met with many of you over the last 5 years, and in meeting with you, I always said that I wanted the Africa Program to be your home away from home. And for me, that meant a place where you could come with a full understanding that we would discuss Africa in a way that looked at not just the challenges that the continent faces, but also some of the opportunities that the continent has to offer, that we would look honestly at the transformation that's going on the continent. And more importantly, that we would always, as Mr. Brown mentioned, have African agency and voice on our panels. We have not done a single event under Brown Capital Management or any of the other African programs without an African voice on that panel. That is important. And your presence here today means a lot to me, and I hope that means that you feel you can come here and discuss your issues. So thank you very much for your support. But let me also thank you, the participants. Again, I see many familiar faces, but there's also new faces in the audience. The Africa program would not be what it was or what it is without your engagement, and that engagement has been active. Sometimes we've solicited the feedback, sometimes we've received it without solicitation, and both are welcome. But you have made this program stronger. And I hope that you too are here. Well, I know you're here because you feel passionately and strongly about the continent and about U.S. Africa relations. Your presence and your engagement have made this program and this forum as successful as it has been, and I thank you all for that engagement, and I hope that continues. Let me take a moment to thank the Africa program staff and the entire Wilson Center team. Their work is absolutely instrumental and critical to allowing us to do the work that we do. For me, the Wilson Center is a special place with an incredible mission. But more importantly, it's the people that work at the Wilson Center that I absolutely admire and respect for their commitment to this mission and their willingness to go over and above to support the mission. So thank you to the IT team and everybody else, the audiovisual team and everybody else at the Wilson Center who supports the Africa program. But I do want to take a moment, it's been 5 years of this partnership, to just acknowledge some of the young people that I have the privilege of working with in the Africa program. Hannah Akwibo, Sharazad Herd, Gamcharai Mwite, and Ian Goreki. A very, very small team of 4 individuals, but these young people are committed to this mission and to the program, and I thank you all for your hard work. I also thank the partners from the Department of State who have come to the Africa program and have contributed to our program. Mike Morrow, thank you so much for your contributions. But let me also highlight some interns. Hannah Alem and Emmanuel Masali, who are working with us on this program. But I want to give a very, very special thank you to 3 interns who've completed their internships and who contributed to the planning of this event. Katia Kaviageli, Zane Cyprus, and Corinthian Spain. You saw the product of your work, and we thank you for everything that you did to contribute to it. So let me conclude there. It was very important for me to say thank you because we cannot succeed without all of you. And I think sometimes in the rush from day to day, we forget to stop and reflect on those who make it possible, those on whose shoulders we stand. And for me, it is all of you. And especially for today, the speakers who came out. Look, I know you're very busy people. You don't have the capacities, maybe with the exception of Pennsylvania, right?
Yes, we do.
Yes. So I know coming here, there was an opportunity cost to you coming here. And so I appreciate the time that you came to come and talk to us and share with us. So thank you very much to you all again. And with that, let me close off this event. And what I'd like to do now is just invite any African ambassadors who are in the audience, the Brown Capital Management Leadership Team, and our speakers to please stay on the stage. We'll take a photo. And then I'd like to invite all of you to a mini reception out in the atrium, and our speakers and Brown Capital Management and the African ambassadors will join you after the photo. So thank you very much to all of you.